which is what I would consider the place-based components of the state's economic development strategy. So things like waterfront development, downtown revitalization, transit-oriented development, brownfield remediation, tourism, capital projects, everything that best prepares our physical communities and our properties for private investment and for growth. And in that regards, we've worked very hard over the last several years in close coordination with our colleagues at Department of Transportation, Energy and Environmental Protection, Department of Housing, through initiatives like the Safer Council, which you'll hear a little bit more about today, to ensure that as we make these investments and reposition our communities for growth, that we're doing so in a way that balances economic with social and environmental objectives. And to that regard, I think the overall theme of this panel in terms of public resources and public investment in green infrastructure is crucial to us, because as we make determinations about how to prioritize our limited funds available for infrastructure investment, we need to identify those that have the greatest range of co-benefits and best position us to achieve, as I said, our economic, social, and environmental objectives. So you heard a lot earlier this morning about the co-benefits. What we're going to hear primarily on this panel is different ways in which communities in the state and beyond are utilizing a wide range of public financing sources to ramp up production of green infrastructure. First, we're going to hear from Jeff Deal, who runs the Infrastructure Bank for the state of Rhode Island, who's going to talk about that. Not unique, but not super common and a strong model partnership that can ramp up and leverage public investment for greater results. Then we're going to hear from Michelle Kondo, who's going to speak about the relationship between green infrastructure and public health, and potentially tapping into other diverse public funding sources that might not otherwise be on the radar of those focused more exclusively on infrastructure. And finally, we'll hear from my colleague here in Connecticut, Rebecca French, who runs the Resilience Program at the Department of Housing, formerly with the University of Connecticut, Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation, about the ways in which Connecticut is attracting federal funding and creating some innovative state funding programs to ramp up the production of green infrastructure. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff, who will get us started.
Thanks, David. How do I, oh, there we are. All right, I got it. This one?
Yep, just the right arrow.
There we go. As David said, my name is Jeff Deal, and I'm the CEO of the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank. And I know this conference is on green infrastructure, but frankly, for the most part at the Infrastructure Bank, we look at it through the lens of stormwater management and resiliency. Although clearly we are thinking about down the road, what else can we be doing with regards to broader green infrastructure in the state of Rhode Island. A couple of things I heard during the course of this morning resonated with me. I think one, Giovanni talked about infrastructure as an engagement tool. At the Infrastructure Bank in Rhode Island, we think about infrastructure really as an economic development tool. And within economic development, that's got a lot of the aspects we've talked about, including public health. And a lot of what we're trying to do with the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank is how can we monetize these additional benefits from projects and look at projects in a more holistic perspective, but also de-aggregate them in a certain way as to how can you bring different financing programs and ultimately funding programs to projects that break it into its component parts and make it more efficient and more, frankly, realistic to finance over the long run. Talked a lot about maintenance and messaging, and that's a lot, again, a lot of what we're working on in the Infrastructure Bank is it's not just about making loans, it's also ensuring that all projects, frankly, and that's a big cause of issues in infrastructure, is lack of maintenance or the lack of planning for maintenance. And I think, we heard from a couple of speakers talk about that, and I think that's a very key component. Just by way of background, the Infrastructure Bank is what we like to say is we're the centralized hub of local infrastructure investment in Rhode Island. And we've got really 4 areas that we focus on. Water, we manage the state's state revolving fund for both clean water and drinking water. Typically, we put sewer on here because a lot of people don't know what clean water refers to. We also have a municipal road and bridge program. In a lot of that, we're also working with communities and the Department of Transportation about how can we put more green, whether it's permeable surface or other green infrastructure into those projects and incentivize communities to be doing more of that. We have a brownfield remediation fund, and we also are focused on energy efficiency and renewables, and we've got a fund that lends money to municipalities for energy efficiency in other quasi-states for energy efficiency renewables, commercial property assessed clean energy, and we're working on a residential property assessed clean energy. When we look at green infrastructure, and infrastructure broadly, we see a number of issues and barriers, and a lot of these have been talked about. I don't think I need to go into them a lot of. Again, what are we really focused on? We're focused on how do we manage to increase stormwater. One of the things that frankly should be required of every presentation the Infrastructure Bank gives is a picture of the Warwick wastewater treatment facility in 2010. A lot of the dialogue in Rhode Island is about coastal resiliency and coastal stormwater and coastal water management. People forget that we have an inland in Rhode Island. And in 2007, it wasn't a hurricane, it was just a really bad rainstorm, which caused a river to flood, which caused the barrier around the wastewater treatment facility in Warwick to be overrun. And the picture from the, as well as part of I-95, the picture from the air is telling. The wastewater treatment facility is completely underwater. It is a large brown smudge. Even in those situations, people don't stop taking showers or using the toilet and flushing it. It was a huge issue. And that's, I'll talk a little bit about, but that's one of the things that we've been focused on is how do we make our infrastructure more resilient? How do we manage stormwater better in the state? And frankly, less expensive and in some cases, better to look at. And that's a lot of what we've been doing. Again, you know, infrastructure, not only in Rhode Island, but really across the country and frankly globally to a great degree, is aged and in many cases ineffective and certainly hasn't been maintained. The financial barriers and issues we see are access to capital. And a lot of, you know, we heard this morning, funding. So there's both funding and financial capital. You know, at the moment, most stormwater initiatives, green infrastructure initiatives rely on grants. Many of those grants provide for payment after the fact. So how do you get from we want to do this project and we know it'll be paid for down the road, but how do we get it done today? And we want to do more of these today because it's less expensive and more effective, and the environment will benefit from it. And again, a lot of talk has been about the funding and the monetization and the ultimate stream of capital that pays for these things, not just finances them. And of course, in municipalities, we've got competing priorities, and that's what we're battling with every day. At the Infrastructure Bank, we look at really kind of 3 different things. There are 3 things that we've kind of created out of the existing programs we have and the existing capital that's made available to us. We've recently created what we call a Stormwater Project Accelerator. It's a Green Infrastructure Accelerator program. We'll talk a little bit about the Resilient Roadie strategy that's just been developed. Frankly, one of my employees I hired a number of years ago, or not a number, about a little over a year ago, to be my Director of Stormwater and Resiliency. We felt that was going to be our next strategic imperative, focusing on stormwater management and resiliency. He was also named by executive order by the governor to be the Chief Resiliency Officer of the state. So he has 2 jobs, because I still make him work for me, not just for the governor. But he's created a strategy for the state around resiliency, and a number of aspects of that are being incorporated. From our perspective at the Infrastructure Bank, the most important component of that is they've identified around almost shovel-ready projects that we can be doing in the state around stormwater and resiliency. And so that's really, from my perspective, the takeaway is now we've got things that we can actually go out and figure out how we're going to finance these things, how are we going to fund them, and how do we get them moving, and make the state more resilient against extreme weather events and sea level rise. We're also taking what we have and trying to be a lot more creative about it. I talked a little bit about looking at projects in a more holistic perspective, but also de-aggregating them into the different components that might be able to access different sources of financing and funding that can make them more economic and move them forward quicker. Stormwater Accelerator Program. This is really bridge financing to accelerate projects today. Funding may be there, may be down the road. Two perfect examples of what we're trying to do is the Department of Transportation in Rhode Island is under a consent decree with the EPA and the Department of Environmental Management in Rhode Island to manage stormwater on their right-of-way. They can meet 75% of that consent decree on their own right-of-way, but they got to figure out how to meet the rest of the 25. So what they've worked with DEM and frankly ourselves is that how can they incentivize green infrastructure and other stormwater management projects to be done next to the right-of-way that they then pay for and get effectively stormwater credits that they can apply to their consent decree. So they've built $100 million into their budget over the next 10 years to do that. But we want to see how we can get it done today. And the challenge is, of course, is that it's a reimbursement program. So nonprofits, cities and towns, they really don't have the money in their budgets to get this done. DOT also knows that Rhode Island's a small place. If they go out and do an RFP for a single engineering firm to do build design and aggregation of projects around the state and the areas they need to manage stormwater, there's only a couple players in Rhode Island who can do that. And they all know each other. And the cost will be much higher than if they try to aggregate the projects separately. And so we've been working with the Department of Environmental Management, Department of Transportation, to go out and aggregate those projects on an individual basis. We've provided the capital to finance those projects today. So we lend money, we're going to be lending money at 0% interest with a fee. We've got to pay our bills. And our payment will be from the DOT's budget. Now, the first couple of projects, we're working with the Noskatucket Watershed Council. So the first one will be a green walkway on a new Citizens Bank property that will create a nice walkway connect the river to another part of the city, addressing many of the issues we talked about before. Well, we'll get that done now, and we'll get paid back by DOT, and we'll start to do that over a period of time. We're also working with the city of Pawtucket, who's got a green infrastructure grant from the Department of Environmental Management. But again, we're going to finance that project, and we'll get paid back by the grant. So we're getting these things done now because it's much less expensive. Talked about the resilient roadie strategy. Again, this really focused on a number of things. It's climate change and the impacts, critical infrastructure and utilities, natural systems, emergency preparedness, community health and resilience, and financing resilience projects. And again, as I said, it identified well over 100 projects that we can start working on and financing those. And we've got the wherewithal in our financing programs at the moment. Of course, some of those we need to figure out how we're going to pay for them. How do we use our programs? We've got two real sources for green infrastructure at the moment. One is our Clean Water State Revolving Fund. And that can handle a lot of what we're doing in the green infrastructure space, whether it's Narragansett Bay Commission building green infrastructure to reduce the capacity and the costs of their combined sewer overflow project, Project 3, it'll cost $600 million. And how do we keep stormwater from getting in there so we can reduce the scope and cost of that? As I said, we're already incorporating green infrastructure into the scope of our work with municipal cities and towns. That didn't come out very well, did it? A couple of projects, again, talk about the messaging. We did a financing of a green infrastructure project at the Bristol Town Beach. This wasn't about keeping the bay clean. It was about keeping the beach open. Right? That was really the messaging. How did the town get the people in the town willing to pay for this? It's like, well, they had 40 closures of the beach every year. After this project, now we've got a couple. Of course, one of the biggest issues was not only stormwater running out of the parking lot, it was the fact that geese like to hang out in the lawn. And the fecal matter from the geese was being run into the bay right there at the beach, and that was really what was causing the closures. So very simple things: green infrastructure in the parking lot, planting trees that kept the geese from landing there. Well, they had to land, I guess, in Warren's Beach, but to pass it upriver. But they blame up bay anyways for the pollution. So again, some of these things are really, how do we re-message these things and get people to understand what the benefits are to them, rather than this is a good thing for the environment or a good thing for the bay. It was really, in this case, how do we keep this town beach open? And oh, by the way, it's really good for the bay and really good for the environment. So you can see the impacts that we have in our accelerator program. It's about expediting projects, moving them forward, getting them done sooner. The environmental impacts are much greater if we get them done now. Yeah, technology always changes, but we can't wait till we know the best technology. But the other thing is it's cheaper to do now, and it's better for the environment to get them done. In Resilient Roadie, it's about multilateral action and engagement of stakeholders around the state. We met with 650 people and communities around the state in developing the strategy. It's not just another plan. And also prioritizing those projects that we talked about. And our creative financing is about leveraging our existing programs and thinking about these projects in a different way. How do we break them up into the components? How do we look at what the sources of benefit are, and can we monetize them? And how do we think about monetizing those? And these projects that we can do, frankly, and some of our programs can range from the $200,000, $100,000 project to the $30 million project. So again, we have the wherewithal to provide financing for small and large. But with that, I'll pass the baton and be ready for questions later. Thank you.
Hello, Michelle Kondo. I'm a scientist and I work for the USDA Forest Service. My research is in support of our mission, which is just simply to sustain the nation's forests and to meet the needs of current and future generations. I am stationed in Philadelphia, and so I'm a member of a team, a unit of scientists that focus their work on urban areas and urban issues. And my research in particular, I look at the relationship between urban vegetation and green space and human health and safety. So the conventions a couple of years ago, you can remember, brought some, shine spotlight on Philadelphia and Cleveland and sort of similar post-industrial cities. A lot about the great things about our city, but also on the, what it says, ignored urban issues. So many of the problems faced by Philadelphia and other similar cities. So we're starting to recognize that zip code, so in Philadelphia, like in the rest of the US, that zip code is more important than genetic code, it can be anyway, in determining our health and our longevity. And so what is this about, and what does it look like sort of on the ground? In Philadelphia, so this is a map of percent below the poverty level. Poverty is very much present and is very much concentrated in certain areas, neighborhoods. And these high-risk environments, high-risk neighborhoods are not healthy in many ways for residents and especially for children. So I'm going to echo some of the things that Dr. Razzani was talking about earlier today. So this is the motivation for my work, definitely. Inside, we have dilapidated housing conditions, we have lead and mold. Outside, we have pollution, we have crumbling infrastructure and vacant properties. In Philadelphia, there's by some counts, 40,000 or more vacant properties. Crime and violence, and lack of quality and quantity, quality green space and recreational amenities. And outside, so both inside and out, we have the stress of living in poverty, with crime and violence, with discrimination and trauma. Parents tell me that they're keeping their kids at home, in front of screens often, and that they just don't have any other choice. It's a life and death type of decision that they're making. I work a lot with pediatricians and with physicians. My main partner, Gina South, is an emergency room physician, and she and others tell me that they're frustrated and really pains them to send their patients back to their homes and neighborhoods and hope that they recover to full health and that they don't see them back again, knowing very well that those environments, those homes and environments, make it nearly impossible for that to happen. So I think that increasingly within medical and health systems, there is we're coming to grips that beyond this sort of individual approach, clinical approach, where you're taking high-risk individuals and you're putting them through classes or what have you, criminal justice system, and telling them you really should change your ways and improve your own health on your own. That it's important to think about and treat the environment in which they're living and making decisions. So changing the context to make individuals' default decisions more healthy. In urban areas, I see two types of interventions, and my research, I very much try to focus on interventions and changes in the environment. I see two types of interventions, both in housing and green space, that are having an effect on human health and safety. And I will share some evidence from my own work, focusing mostly on green space, no, not completely. And then we'll talk about some of the financing of these programs. First of all, the green stormwater infrastructure. Here's my GSI slide and project. This was an earlier study of mine where we looked at some of those early phase GSI projects in Philadelphia that Gerald was talking about. Between 2000 and 2012, there were 52 projects constructed by that time. So my team and I, we took those projects. We wondered, and we weren't alone. In wondering whether there was any impact on community crime rates as well as on health measures for nearby residents. So we matched these project sites with control sites. They're sort of waitlist sites that were eligible for green infrastructure but hadn't received them yet. And we looked, before and after. We compared crime rates to look for that change at the project sites compared to at control sites. And we found significant reductions, up to 27%, around the green infrastructure sites in narcotics possession. Although we didn't see any differences in the health measures, and it could have to do with sort of the coarseness of the survey data that we were using. Many post-industrial cities like Philadelphia are dealing with this overabundance, oversupply of vacant land, and they know that this vacant space plays a role in health and well-being, and it plays a role in crime and violence in many of these cities. And so cities are, they're put in this place where they have to. It's just, they're having to deal with it in some way. One of the sort of a common way to deal with vacant space is to clean and green. So I call this a traditional clean and green. Light? Yeah, here. So it looks something like this. And this model really, I think, was championed, I guess, or established with the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society in Philadelphia, a land care program, which I'm going to talk about soon. Youngstown, Ohio is a city that, they approached my colleagues and I and asked, they said, we have this feeling that our Lots of Green program is having an effect on crime and violence, so we want you to help us evaluate that. So indeed, and they had two different sort of versions, this traditional clean and green and a community sort of application-based version where residents could apply for support to do their own greening. Most of them were community gardens or orchards. And we found statistically significant reductions at these lots. There were 300 of them, and we matched them with about 1,000 control vacant lots where nothing happened. Significant reductions across the board in all types of crimes, but mostly in property crimes around these clean and green lots versus in reductions in violent crimes. And this is relative, again, around these community reuse lots. So got me thinking more about some of the mechanisms of that relationship there. And so this early evidence, I think, helped us establish and obtain funding from the National Institutes of Health to do a first randomized controlled trial of vacant lot greening. So this study, recently published, was based on 5 years of work. NIH funded both the evaluation and the programmatic costs for treatment of these lots. So I think this is 5 years ago, or prior, you wouldn't have heard of NIH doing that kind of work. And so what we did was we had 3 arms, 200 treatment lots with a traditional clean and green. We also had 200 sort of partial treatment lots where crews just went and picked up trash, routine maintenance, and then 200 control lots that remained vacant throughout the study. We went out, we conducted surveys with residents near all of these lots before and after the intervention. We also collected police reports, and we found that residents reported feeling safer, and they reported going out and spending time outside their homes more often in around the cleaned and green lots compared to the control lots. And we also found significant reductions in crime overall, and then more specifically in violent crimes and gun-related crimes, in burglary and in nuisance crimes. And then in a second analysis of the survey data, we looked at some of the mental health outcomes and found that residents reported significantly reduced depression and feeling of worthlessness. So these are residents that live near the treatment lots compared to control lots. So I want to skip this, but based on our findings of decrease in violence, both firearm and non-firearm related violence, we have made a return on investment calculation. So based on costs, a typical cost is $1,600 per year not per year, but to clean and green one of these lots, and then about $200 per year for maintenance. We found $26 in net benefits to taxpayers and $333 to society at large for every dollar invested in this program. And this is based on avoided costs associated with these crimes, and to the individual, loss of life and livelihood, and based on criminal justice system costs, and to costs for society at large. So what else do we need to do to convince groups, organizations, agencies that this type of intervention is a viable public health intervention? So I'm going to talk about 3 different programs really quickly. So PHS, how is it funded? It started back in 1999. Most of the project's funding, annual budget about $3 million per year, and that includes not just land care, but sort of a suite of other programs, all from the city's general fund. So this is the city paying for its own program, and then a very small portion coming from community development block grants, so at the federal level, and the Housing Authority as well. But you can see, so after, since 2015, that PHS has managed over, conducted maintenance and management of over 10,000 vacant lots per year, and so a huge benefit to the city, but a little bit precarious here with this single giant investment of the city. I can tell you also a little bit about the nature prescription program, so very similar to the one that Dr. Razzani. I want to talk about the funding mechanism for this program in Philadelphia. The Children's Hospital, so pediatricians are starting to give nature prescriptions there. And so how is this program funded? It's a lot of volunteer efforts on the part of pediatricians, and as well as this training. But it started with a small grant from Independence Blue Cross. So I think we're starting to see health insurance agencies, companies, organizations investing in nature-based therapies, solutions as more of a preventative approach. And I had to share this program as well. So as I mentioned, so health systems are starting to recognize it makes little financial sense to send patients back into neighborhoods that are sort of making them ill in the first place. So some hospitals are starting to expand the notion of a patient to the neighborhood, and this is one very innovative program in Columbus through at Nationwide Children's Hospital. It's called the Healthy Neighborhoods, Healthy Families Initiative, and since 2008, they've really focused on one neighborhood that is adjacent to the hospital, high rates of poverty, foreclosures, and patients, sort of the highest cost patients in the region. They have helped, the hospital has helped fund almost 100 home renovations, 31 new builds, and then these home improvement grants to homeowners in the neighborhood. Very innovative, and the source of this funding, most of it comes from the hospital, which is coming from actually Medicaid. So this is a different, they're taking a different approach at the state level. They've been given this option to set up an accountable care organization instead of this fee-for-service model. So they're taking that money that they would have received, I guess, from billing, right, for hospital stays, and investing it instead in the neighborhood in which these patients are returning to. And in a 2015 study, they found per patient expenditures increased 85% more slowly for patients enrolled in an ACO, accountable care organization, compared to the traditional fee-for-service model. So they're starting to see, and I'm involved as well in helping them to evaluate this program in terms of neighborhood violence, crime, and hospital admission rates and all of that. So lots of information here. There are many different mechanisms for funding, and I think we're starting to see health and healthcare industries invest in these types of interventions as public health strategies. And so I think that I hope that some of my research will help sort of mainstream this idea and the viability of nature-based health interventions. Thanks.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Rebecca French. I'm the Director of Resilience for the Connecticut Department of Housing for the state of Connecticut. And I'm going to be talking about state and federal funding sources for green infrastructure focused on Connecticut programs I've been involved in both in my current position at Department of Housing as well as my previous position up until April 2018. I was working as the Director of Community Engagement for University of Connecticut's Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation. So I'm going to start with one of the Circa programs that was really the first and really only grants program in Connecticut strictly focused on resilience, called Resilience, dedicated to resilience activities. And it's a small grants program focused on municipalities. The funding for Circa came from a grant from the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection to Yukon, and it's co-led by the Commissioner of DEP and the Vice President for Research at Yukon, and it's the Executive Director is Professor Jim O'Donnell, who's a professor in the Department of Marine Sciences at Yukon. And so they, I've got a little Mac PC thing going on, sorry. It's Bridgeport, you can read that's on this side is a picture of Bridgeport. This is actually a rendering of what this little bit of coastline in Bridgeport could look like with an installed living shoreline approach, as well as a view deck. That view deck doesn't exist there currently, but this was some funding we provided to actually the Metropolitan Council of Governments, working with the city to imagine how they could install a living shoreline, which is green infrastructure based for reducing erosion at a shoreline without hardening your shoreline. And the goal of living shorelines is to both enhance habitat as well as to mitigate erosion. So in this location, they were going to restore a wetland and change the grade of the slope so that it's a more gentle grade, and that decreases wave runoff. And I'm not going to do the science behind that, but it helps with erosion. And this is a rather blurry picture of the Connecticut River in Hartford. A grant went to the city of Hartford to hire a green infrastructure specialist for a year. They were placed in the city government in the Office of Sustainability, working with their climate group. And they developed a handbook for green infrastructure approaches across the city. And as I understand it, surveying, what was existing green space in the city, what improvements could they make, how could they enhance and promote more green infrastructure across the city. And the idea behind these grants to municipalities for Circa was to have transferable solutions. So I would direct you to Circa's website, circa.yukon.edu, where you can find products from both of these cities, and I hope you can apply the lessons learned from these cities to New Haven and elsewhere. New Haven's also been a recipient of these funds to study the bioswales. That's it. The research presented this morning is funded by Yukon Circa as well at Quinnipiac and Yale. Some federal funding projects that I was involved in that Circa was a partner on in my role there brought me into this. As, again, these are living shorelines projects, so green infrastructure at the shoreline. These are reef balls at Stratford Point. They're installed there to break up waves before they reach the shore, so you can build a wetland behind it. The funding mechanism behind this was from the Long Island Sound Study, EPA. It's an estuary program, so straight grant, but it's definitely a public-private partnership. This land is owned by DuPont, who's responsible for remediation on the site. There's lead shot contamination there. It was a shooting range for a long time. So they had to clean it up, and they were finding that their cleanup was being eroded and then exposing more contaminated soil. So they needed to fix the erosion problem in order to not have to do yet again another remediation at the site. So they pledged their funding against this Long Island Sound funding and was able to fund this pilot project, which has now been expanded to 750 feet of shoreline in that area, installing these reef balls and wetland and dune behind it. On the right is just a little snapshot of the pamphlets that were developed as part of a grant. Again, this is all grant funding from NOAA through their Community Coastal Resilience Grant Program, which is slightly changes names every year it comes out. But NOAA keeps putting this funding out, so Congress keeps putting a little funding into these resiliency programs. And this grant was given to the Northeast Regional Ocean Council. We are working with Rhode Island as part of NROC. All the coastal states in New England together are developing this guidance for how to install living shorelines. And the next round of grant they got is actually to test feasibility. So actually in Connecticut, Yukon is working with Sacred Heart at this site and monitoring wave action to understand how well this site is working. And we need much more of that research for living shorelines. So bond funds as another state. I mean, these are really, these are existing programs. They're just being applied to resilience here. But state of Connecticut is using bond funds to fund green infrastructure. That's the source of the funding that Giovanni is leading here in New Haven, East Shore Park, and New Haven Long Wharf, installing 2 living shorelines projects. I'm very excited to see this going because I was in conversation with Giovanni early on about those projects and have been staring at this site every time I drive past it on 95 being like, when are we gonna do it? And we're finally gonna do it. So it's very exciting. I'm glad the state of Connecticut is making an investment. And how did these funds come about? This was a few years ago. That was identified that we should be making investments in resiliency for Long Island Sound, but it took a couple of years for the funding to actually get allocated to a project. But I'm glad the Bond Commission approved that, and it's now allocated. So I'm moving really quickly to sort of survey many different kinds of programs. So now we're onto the programs that I'm currently overseeing. This is federal state disaster recovery funding. Again, not called resilience, but being applied to resilience problems and installing green infrastructure. This is the Rebuild by Design competition. It was a design competition that came to the Sandy impact communities, but the source of the funding is disaster recovery dollars because we were impacted by Sandy. And this is $10 million was allocated to the state of Connecticut for planning and construction. And I've been listening very closely to the talks today because we're going to be installing what really is designed to treat stormwater, and that's our primary goal. We're trying to address chronic flooding in the neighborhood. In every rainstorm we get this area, I get photos of flooded streets up to the middle of cars parked up into the middle of their wheel well. It's a serious problem on a regular basis, not just under extreme events. And so we're going to be addressing that. We're also going to be providing dry access, so during an extreme event, so there's a safe way for the communities here to evacuate and for emergency vehicles to get in. But I've been thinking about this green space and what are its other utilities, so I'm grateful to the organizers of this conference today to open up my eyes to what we can do and the public health benefits maybe that I can utilize from this space and what we might be able to do here in addition to that to capture some of those additional benefits in this area. Disaster recovery also funded the bioswales program here through CDBG-DR. Again, disaster recovery programs don't have any specific language about green infrastructure, so it's really, the onus is on the municipalities and the state to say we're going to use our disaster recovery dollars in this way. If you've never been part of a community development block grant disaster recovery program, they really do send a big chunk of money to the state where the disaster comes, and then municipalities, in our case, municipalities had to apply to the state of Connecticut and tell them what projects they wanted to do. So really municipalities had a great deal of control, and New Haven came with this project and said we want to get $2.5 million to install several hundred 200 bioswales in the city of New Haven to address stormwater as a resiliency measure as part of their impacts from Sandy, because and we can also, because we can see this funding as both repair, but also for mitigation. So that's why you can do resiliency under disaster recovery, that you can look forward to the next storm in your recovery efforts and say, we want to use the money to address the impacts we might face in the future. The dollar amounts are kind of increasing as I go through my slide presentation here, and that's on purpose. I'm to show you that the biggest dollar amounts really I've seen across the country for resilience and green infrastructure are coming through disaster recovery programs. This was a $53 million grant that came to the state of Connecticut through the National Disaster Resilience Competition. We were one of only 13 winners nationwide for this competition. And it's really building off of the Rebuild by Design effort that I showed earlier, but we're going to take, this is the Rebuild by Design project is over here addressing chronic flooding. On this side, we're going to address storm surge, coastal storm surge, because we have a much greater source of funding, and we're going to take this whole area out of the 1% annual chance floodplain plus 2.5 feet of sea level rise. And we're going, I don't have lots of schematics here, but in this area, we'll be integrating what is it's going to be a wall, but it's going to be a wall that's integrated into the landscape. And we also hope to create amenities, including green space, enhance the amenities of the area. There's Seaside Park, which is designed by Olmsted, is here. And so our elevated road and sheet pile flood wall beneath it is going to integrate with the head of the park here, and we're going to create, hopefully, enhanced view sheds there, viewing areas. And again, talks I've seen today are really inspiring me to ask some different questions of my consulting team about what we could do in that space for the communities that live there. I'm touching briefly on how policy and funding work together. These projects that I've reviewed so far have not all come out of SAFER, but are now flowing through the state agencies Fostering Resilience Council. About every quarter we get together and talk amongst all 9 state agencies about what we're all doing on resilience, what initiatives we want to see in the state. Our goal is to create a resilience roadmap for the state of Connecticut. And this was one of our early visions that came out of the National Disaster Resilience Competition, this vision of looking at Connecticut's shoreline, taking advantage of high ridge lines extending out to the coast, protecting our shorelines, elevating homes, using living shorelines, green infrastructure, but also looking upland and thinking about the long-term viability of our coastline and how we also need to make investments in areas that are inherently resilient out of the floodplain. We're fortunate enough in Connecticut that those exist, and we're not as flat as Florida. I'm very glad about that every day. And one of the major initiatives, again, the National Disaster Resilience Competition came out of this group of agencies talking together, working together, and creating a vision for Connecticut. It's also resulted in legislation. This was championed by the Connecticut DEP, but with significant input from all the state agencies, and will impact all state agencies. This is Public Act 1882, an act concerning climate change planning and resiliency. Big ticket item on it was, of course, about greenhouse gas emissions, but in there as well was a commitment to using sea level rise scenarios for not only for planning, which was already existed. There was a legislation post-Sandy that was about planning, but now we have required all future state projects located in the coastal boundary that are either undertaken by a state agency or funded by a state, federal grant or loan to meet circus projections. So this is everything, folks. I mean, every project in this coastal area now has to think about sea level rise. And so what we've done is taken one of my lessons learned, my really final thought here, that we need to institutionalize policies around resilience and adaptation in order to get the funding to flow. Because the funding programs I've showed you here, they were grant programs, they're kind of one-offs, but we spend money on infrastructure every day, hundreds of millions of dollars in this state. We need to make sure that resiliency is part of that, and green infrastructure is a big part of the solution there. And there's also there's a paper I wrote about looking forward to different financing mechanisms. I knew that the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank was going to cover some of these kinds of things, but something we've also been thinking about in Connecticut are revolving loan funds through our Clean Water Fund that you can use to finance green infrastructure projects in the state. We put forward an idea in this paper about property assessed resilience modeled after CPACE at the Green Bank, basically using enhancements in property value to pay for resilience projects, including green infrastructure. And we're the first in the nation state to have a loan to elevate homes. It maybe wasn't as taken up by as many homeowners as we had initially hoped in the state of Connecticut, but it has been copied now, at least in Virginia. They passed similar legislation based on what Connecticut did. So we have more opportunities to see if that kind of revolving loan fund works for resilience issues. and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you all. While folks start thinking about your questions, and if you have one, I encourage you to start raising your hand so that the folks with the mic can start to migrate towards you. I might just start the conversation with a couple questions up here. And first for Jeff, I mean, I was struck first and foremost by, having the infrastructure bank have both transportation funding as well as green infrastructure and wastewater treatment and energy. Typically in most places, agencies are so one outcome specific that trying to layer on other project components becomes increasingly difficult. And so I guess I was wondering from your experience whether having all that under one roof enables you to tack on, say, green infrastructure to a road project in a way that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. And then somewhat related to that, how important was the consent decree in getting the transportation folks in particular on board?
Well, I guess, one of the challenges of having these different, there's a benefit and a challenge. Challenge is that we have these siloed little programs that are separately capitalized, and capital can't easily flow from one to the other, although when we leverage it in the bond market, we do have a temporary ability to use capital from one program to support troubled loans in the other. But one thing I didn't talk about is we had, when the Clean Water Finance Agency was reconstituted 3 years ago into the Infrastructure Bank, they created what was called a Green Infrastructure Strategic Advisory Council, which was made up of the department heads of most of the departments in the government, our project partners, environmental management, health, transportation, Office of Energy Resources, commerce. And that was really the beginning of the collaboration around this stormwater accelerator. Because we had everybody in the room. Okay, the council's only met once. It's only been around, it should meet once a year. It's met once in the last 2. But it got people into the room and started this idea of how do we accelerate investment in green infrastructure. And that started the partnership with DOT and DEM around this program we've now set up. And I think that was a very important thing. And it's enabled us also to rethink how do we serve customers rather than programs. Because all our programs pretty much cover the same people. So we've reorganized ourselves to cover customers, maybe a bit unique, but it enables us to have a conversation about infrastructure broadly and look across all these sectors and have influence on our partner departments. So, applications come in for projects and they get scored on a project priority list by our partner department. One of the things we found in Department of Transportation, municipal roads, somebody came in with a repaving project but with permeable surface. Department of Transportation scored it as a resurfacing, low priority. And we'll stop. That's not the behavior we want to encourage. How do we change this? Okay, well, we can kind of jam it into economic development, right? Because it throws off, it makes maintenance a lot less over the long run, right? You don't have to resurface it every 3 years because it gets flooded, and in our winters in New England, the surface breaks up. So it has enabled us to have a different conversation with our partner departments around how do we restructure and how do we change behavior through simple things like prioritization. So if it's a higher priority, it's going to get first call on capital. And so centralizing this into one place has had that benefit of enabling us to have a broader conversation around infrastructure and how do we incentivize behavior that is more environmentally and frankly long-term economically friendly. I'm sorry, you had a second part of the question there and I forgot.
Well, just how important the consent decree was to bringing along particularly.
Well, I mean, that's a driver of the funding, right? I mean, they have to do it. If they don't do it, they start to pay pretty significant fines. So it's built into their budget. Of course, what we're trying to do is also think about how do we get these projects done today and how can we use the capital at the infrastructure bank to get those done and pay for it out of the budget over the years. I mean, at this point, we're kind of looking at near-term risk of payment. We're, as we start to do more projects, we're going to take more appropriation risk, but we don't think that that's very significant because, again, you've got this hammer, the consent decree down the road, that if they don't comply, it becomes extremely expensive.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot, actually, of sort of the current trends in transportation infrastructure where communities around the country are realizing, we're not going to have the bond capacity to fund this. There's not the same amount of grants as there once was from the federal government, and we want to achieve more quicker than we have historically. And so there's a whole series of loan programs that are looking to be leveraged. Amazingly, though, yet, communities, and I think this is a major take-home, have not yet figured out exactly how to utilize it. So there are, for example, billions of dollars of federal transportation loans that are not being utilized because communities are just such in the habit of going after grants that, bringing down something that could be 75% loan to full project cost by bringing in other revenue sources is just not the way we've had to historically think about infrastructure, but it can enable us to ramp up a lot more quickly.
Sorry, just one other thing. I mean, I think it's also, these partnerships that we've been able to bring around the table. We're working on one project where we've got, a local municipally owned water company, DEM, Department of Health, Save the Bay, Department of Transportation. It's about removing a dam to protect, to increase, improve the state of water behind it. It's going to run downstream into the bay, but it also, we've got to put a bigger culvert downstream to accommodate this water. But also happens to be on a road that floods all the time. And DOT is like, well, we don't have the budget for that. Well, when we got the director of the Department of Transportation, he's like, okay, we're going to raise this road. It's going to cost us this much money, but it's not going to be underwater 4 months out of the year. And it's going to last longer. We won't have to replace it every couple of years or repave it because it's going to be now raised and above the flooding that we have every time it just rains. And so there it was an increased awareness of this makes perfect sense. And he looks at his people like, why was this even a question, right? Of course, they got to move the budget around, but again, this was a part of getting the right people in the room and putting it in the right way in terms of messaging. Of this was a multi-aspect project that had a lot of different benefits, including just we had to raise the road to handle the more water coming downstream, but raising the road is a good thing because now it's not going to flood every time it rains. And if it gets flooded in the wintertime, it's not going to crack up when it freezes. So a very, you kind of look at it and say, well, that was kind of simple, but it wasn't really. It took quite some time to get everybody around the table and understand and move forward.
Yeah, well, and it's hard enough linking the disparate sources of funding with the beneficiaries in a situation like that. Health is just scaling it up to a whole nother level. I was incredibly intrigued, and I don't know what ended up happening with it, but last year Hawaii was petitioning the federal government to allow Medicaid expenditures to be used on housing because they had very clear indicators that homeless or those that were not in high standard consistent housing were much more likely to be spending more on health costs. I don't know whatever came of that, but do you see this as a potential trend, Michelle, where where healthcare costs and deferred healthcare costs could potentially be a source of revenue for projects that improve the environment more generally?
Oh, I think so. There are other examples in Seattle, and Minneapolis, and others. Yeah, I mean, I think if you do the calculations, that we're seeing that it pays off. And so, getting more hospitals and counties, cities to actually go ahead and do it, and with the ability to do it, I think the more that we'll see this type of thing.
And how important it looked like from that sort of capital stack in that project. I mean, the hospitals were a big piece of it, but there was also a lot of philanthropic and civic community, and how difficult was pulling together that partnership?
Oh, well, yeah, it took, I think probably, it was over at least a decade of building that partnership. And,
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, I think it just goes to show the importance of the research. The more that we can demonstrate quantifiable health benefits through green space. I mean, the origins of urban planning being in public health, we've kind of moved apart over the years and forgotten that the environment is really a determinant on a lot of the aspects of our health.
And if I could
Rebecca,
weigh in on that, David, I want to agree that the more studies we can point to of equating those benefits with some cost, because in the disaster recovery program, in the National Disaster Recovery Program, actually in disaster recovery programs, you don't usually have to pass a BCA, but in National Disaster Resilience Competition, we had to present a comprehensive benefit cost analysis to justify our project. And the thing that we struggled with the most was how to quantify the benefits of green space, adding amenities. It was pretty easy to show if you take everything out of the floodplain, suddenly you can develop it. There's a huge, quantifiable benefit there. But, we knew that there were going to be these other benefits to the community. And something I should have mentioned in my presentation is that Stormwater Park is directly adjacent to what will be an affordable housing development. So, we're very concerned with, we want to create an amenity that's going to have multiple benefits to the adjacent communities there. And, it would have been great to get just a little bit more money so that I could do more with that green space, aside from just managing stormwater issues.
I think, you raised a good point, and the question was asked earlier, how can academic research support these efforts? And a lot of it is also multidisciplinary. So it's not just forestry and environmental studies, right? It's exactly how do we build this data of what the benefits are, and then take it to the next level of assigning a cost or a benefit to that, which is how we start to monetize these things and create the funding. Because if you're either foregoing a cost or creating a real benefit, cost Medicaid less if they support housing. If we build a project today, a green infrastructure today, that's budgeted 5 years from now, it's going to cost us less today, and we're going to have those benefits up front. And how do we qualify that? And I think that's really where that research can take, how do we generate the data and then put a cost to that, which is going to be multidisciplinary and not just any particular school within a university or multiple universities. And, how do we pull that together to create the information we need to demonstrate not only the benefit, but the cost that's associated, or the cost that's avoided, frankly.
Absolutely. There's a question up front and one in the back there. Where are the mics? Perfect.
I have a question for Michelle. Has the experience that you've been, or research that you've been doing around public health, have there been any edible landscapes that have been researched, and sort of how those, related to public health?
Toward what outcome? Toward
I guess, some of the factors that you're talking about in terms of stress or cholesterol or all those things, are there any properties that may have been vacant that had edible trees or
yeah. So the Youngstown project, right? About 80 of those lots were turned into community gardens or orchards. Definitely an edible component there, and so we saw more decline or relative decrease in violent crimes around those lots. And so, and then what else? There have been a lot of studies about whether participation in gardening activities, what does that do to our stress levels? Not so much here, but in Europe, Netherlands, and it seems like a lot of those studies are coming from. Difficult to do, it's important to control, have control groups and adequate sample size and all of that, but.
Has anyone ever lived on a street where you could pick fruit off a tree while you're walking down the street? It's pretty incredible, I would imagine. I haven't experienced it myself, but. Question in the back?
Yeah, thank you. My question is to Jeff. And the investment into infrastructure, which is leading to resilience and thereby to a value proposition in the area surrounding and benefiting from that infrastructure investment. Do you employ any kind of formal mechanisms to capture the value proposition, particularly the real estate value? And there's a second question to yourself as well. do you see growth in the private companies who are investing into infrastructure in terms of their market value or the market share? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the first question in terms of how do you to add value to resilience, and that's one of the things that we've been working with a number of others at Coastal Resource Management Council and local insurance companies and mortgage bankers, because I think that's really, certainly when we look at, we're looking at a similar project of raising homes in the South Counties in Rhode Island with the Army Corps of Engineers. We'd like them to give us the money and let us run it as a revolving loan fund, but not sure we're going to be successful in that because we learned a lot of lessons that Rebecca in Connecticut had. But a lot of it is about, as we start to price in risk, what we're trying to do with regards to our investments in wastewater treatment facilities and others is how do you increase your resiliency? How do you make sure that, that 100-year or 500-year storm is not going to inundate your facility and stop it from running? So we're starting to drive a lot of that and forcing that infrastructure that we're reinvesting in to have a plan and to demonstrate it's going to be. The next step really is a lot of, if you do certain things. I think there's a famous picture, I'm not sure if everybody's seen it, of the one home in Florida that was standing after the hurricane, right? Because they built it to withstand those winds. It was expensive. But again, if mortgages price this risk in properly, if insurance prices that risk, and I think the insurance industry is moving there. But again, part of it's what's holding back is also federal government and its subsidy of a lot of things, including flood insurance. So when we start to see these risks being priced into other things, we can point to, if you do this, you'll avoid that cost, right? And this gets back to not only some of the research, but also really business practices. And if people recognize the risks that are in there, they start to price them in, then we can take a look of, if you do this with infrastructure, whether it's a home or a road or a sewer facility, if you do things, you're going to avoid this specific cost. And we can quantify it, and we know what it is today instead of thinking, well, kind of it's like this. And so we are seeing a lot more of that. At the Infrastructure Bank, we're trying to work with private sector partners to do that. In terms of private sector investment in the infrastructure and in resilience, we're starting to see a lot more of that. I mean, we run to a certain degree, a modified public-private partnership. I mean, the capital that we leverage in the bond market with private sector investors, between 3, 4, 5, 6 times. So roughly 2/3 of the capital we're investing is private sector. It's lent to us, and we lend it on. Again, bringing private sector investors, and I guess that'll be the next panel, so I'll be interested in hearing that. But a lot of it also is where does the return come from that helps compensate private sector investors? Ours are debt holders, so it's an easy, right? It's an interest rate that gets charged on the loan that we make back, and we pay it out to investors. But we are starting to see it. I mean, our property, our commercial property assessed clean energy that Rebecca referred to, unlike our friends at Connecticut Green Bank, we weren't given any money to run the program. So we've set up a program that is exclusively private sector lenders on a panel, and we hold competitive bids for the benefit of the businesses or nonprofits that take advantage of that program to lower fees and lower costs, and it's been successful. So our program is completely funded, financed by private sector. We've just set up the platform, the way it works. We take all the work out of the communities in terms of the assessments. We do all the billing and collecting, so there's no worry about funding being mixed with other municipal. But we have a completely private sector operation that works towards certain goals and protections for ultimately the borrowers. So we are starting to see some of that in Rhode Island and in our programs as well.
I think we've got time for one more question on the far right here, and while the mic's going over there, I'll just say there's a good local example of value capture from green infrastructure in the city of Stamford, where a federal grant resulted in dam removal, which constrained the floodplain, which resulted in development, which created a tax increment, which was captured to bond against to create parkland, which created future value, and it becomes a self-sustaining prophecy, and it's a fantastic example, the Mill River tax increment finance.
So such a great conference, and it's inspiring to hear about the funding, the integrative funding in Rhode Island. And I wondered if David and Rebecca could comment on I work on the North Branch of the Park River in Hartford, and getting funding for integrative planning for flood control, for the long-term control plan, which is spending $2 billion in the city, for the University of Connecticut Law School's property, for wildlife conservation, and for the 12 K through 12 schools along there. To get integrative funding has been a 10-year challenge, and really we've only been working with 319 funding. So from your perspective, how do we get to that place where, is it the state that tells the city to focus on that kind of integrative work, or since so many of those projects are actually state projects, like the long-term control plan, who's the leader in the room?
Well, I think David maybe can speak from the deputy commissioner side of things, and I'll talk from the staff level. Some of the funding that's coming for national disaster resilience is going towards a resilience planning effort. Unfortunately, because it's tied to where Sandy hit and is still recovering, it's only in Fairfield and New Haven counties, but congratulations, New Haven, you are part of that planning effort. And so their funding can drive integrated planning. Certainly CIRCA worked and awarded small grants to councils of government that at least try to work across municipalities, and because they don't, we don't have county government, they don't have their own budget, but giving them a grant does allow them to work on those kinds of issues. But yeah, I mean, in Connecticut, municipalities drive a lot of things. So really, the leaders in the municipalities do have to step up and say that's what they want to do. From the state agency side, at least the Department of Housing, again, we run a great deal of grant programs, and that's why I certainly think that one of the big levers that we can keep pulling, and we did pull with Public Act 18-82, is tying requirements to state grants that go out the door. But maybe David can speak to.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with all that. I would just say briefly, I think maybe we just take the lesson from sea level rise, where we had legislation initially that said, you should be thinking about this. Now we have legislation that says you must consider 2 feet by 2050. Right now, the Clean Water Fund says you could do some green infrastructure. Perhaps we transition where with a portion of your Clean Water Fund, you must do green infrastructure, and that will force that integrated planning approach. And I think we've seen with sea level rise as a model for how we incrementally move from a may to a shall, and that forces a different type of collaborative thinking. Yeah, well, thank you very much. Thank you all for the fantastic questions. Thank you to the panelists. Good job, guys.
Next panel starts right away. You want to stand up and shake yourself out. Yeah, no, I think we're good. So I meant it when I said stand up for a minute, because we're going to start the next panel. And it's a great follow-on from the one we just finished. So, because people were talking about where's the private sector? So we're going to give you some perspectives from the private sector about some of the experiments that are going on, some of the efforts to think about capital stacks, as David said, that include not only public money but private money as well. And we have a great panel to explore many of these areas. I will say that this is an exploration. Traditional sources of funding for municipalities often have a pretty good advantage over private sources because of the tax-free interest
on much of that, or the grant funding on much of that, but I think for the bridging reasons and for the scope of investments needed reasons, there's a lot of interest in this area. So I'm Brad Gentry. I'm on the faculty here at the school and help run the Center for Business and the Environment, where a lot of our work is on how do we get more investment in natural areas along the urban-rural continuum. And our panel lists are coming at that topic from a couple of different angles. So first, Anadi Johari will talk a little bit about green bonds, some of the debt instruments, and sort of open the door on some of the equity approaches that are happening in this area. And for those of you who are not finance people, equity does not mean fairness. It means ownership. And so thinking about where people are in the capital stack is an important part there. And then Ben Cohen will all come up. Nadi has some slides to sort of set the stage. And then we'll all come up, and Ben Cohen will talk a bit about his work at Quantified Ventures, a lot of which is on environmental impact bonds and social impact bonds. So thinking about traditional debt and taking it closer to equity. And then Ricardo Bayon from Encourage Capital will talk both about some of the work they've been doing to try to put equity to work, particularly around stormwater, where there's trading involved, but also about some of the new sort of shared funding models that they're playing with. So with that, Anadi, if you're ready to come up and get us started, that'd be great.
Thank you, Brad. My name is Anadi Johari, and I have been working in the area of project finance, private equity, renewables for over a couple of decades. I'm also an SOM grad, and I have been affiliated with ISIF, so some of the issues we're going to talk about are very close to what I have been, close to my heart and what I have been focused on.
Can you make sure to get close to the mic?
Okay, sure. So I just wanted to set the stage in terms of 3 or 4 main themes that I think are important for a private finance sector discussion. One of which is really the need for sustainable infrastructure and the infrastructure challenge we face as a global community. And it's just not in the US, urban, rural, but it's really a global infrastructure challenge. And really thinking about resilience, thinking about sustainability is become a very important consideration, not just from the point of view of sustainability-minded investors, but also as a way to create value and risk mitigation. The other bigger topic is in the last 10 years, we have seen emergence of new financing instruments that have tremendous potential in terms of harnessing capital from institutional sources and channelizing them into areas where they were not channelized before. Green bonds is just one market intervention. I'm going to talk about that. And then broadly, what innovations do we need to blend different sources of capital? Because the capital challenge in front of us is huge. We need all public, private, muni, name it, grants, impact capital in various forms to really help the build out. How do I turn this on? So we've seen really a number of sources really that call into question, really most of the sources really talk about the infrastructure challenge in terms of the incremental funding needed as business as usual, and the number of estimates. And all of the estimates point to really a big gap in funding. And the question is, how do we channelize that? McKinsey came out with a study. They predicted that is over 90 trillion is needed, 6 trillion a year. Current funding is about 2-3 trillion. There's a delta. The recent IPCC reports don't really come up with an estimate, but the magnitude is much larger given the urgency of it. McKinsey also, just to put a context, if we were to value the existing long-lived asset base, it's about 50 trillion. And so we need to really rebuild that infrastructure that has been built over centuries. So there's a huge investment opportunity that is needed, just looking at the scale in terms of growth, the climate challenge, and in terms of the new areas that are emerging globally. the need for climate integration is something that is new, and I think increasingly sponsors, issuers are beginning to think about resilience as a way to incorporate or safe-proof or to avoid the risk of assets becoming stranded, and that's something that I'm going to touch on. The other slide, we've seen a lot more weather volatility, something that everyone knows. There is a lot of the severe weather conditions have occurred in the last 10 years than the last 50 years or 100 years. That, again, brings home the urgency of the situation. Again, climate risk in the context of infrastructure is being framed as a systemic risk that investors are really concerned about, what they have in their portfolios, which essentially means that a lot of the capital is now going to be directed towards climate-aligned, the number of themes, climate-aligned, green, sustainable infrastructure, and for-profit and non-profit. If we think about a subset of sustainable infrastructure, there are many ways to define sustainable infra, but one subset is energy infrastructure, and within which clean energy is a big focus. A lot of the clean energy will get deployed within a number of economic jurisdictions, whether it's the cities, the municipalities, whether it sits on private balance sheets or elsewhere. And if we see the trajectory of investments that has risen consistent in the last 15 years, and where we are today is still a healthy clip, 300, 400 billion per annum globally, and this includes all debt and equity. And the investors in these are institutional investors largely who are looking for returns across strategies, whether it's private equity, growth equity, venture capital, all of that is embedded here. But a large part of the numbers that you see here of the order of $300, $400 billion is asset finance. So it's the wind farms, the solar farms, the waste to energy. And that capital is likely to increase in large part because clean energy is being recognized as really investable infrastructure asset class. There was recently a survey done by Probitas, which is a private placement firm, raises capital. They surveyed a list of global LPs, and they found that renewables are one of the top investing themes for infrastructure equity today. This is something that, going back to how the savings and investments come together, at the end of the day, we're all intermediaries trying to monetize global savings into productive investments, whether it comes from bank balance sheets or an asset manager or institutional investor. But at the end of the day, what we're seeing is that there are bottlenecks in some of those intermediation, and there are some that are a lot more liquid, but we see this landscape changing as newer forms of capital emerge. I don't know if this is visible, but okay, so here is how I characterize where we are today. So I've been in this space for a long time, and I think over the years we've seen a number of labels and monikers and describing what kind of investing you do. But to me, everything kind of converges. There's no difference at the end of the day. So we know SRI, we know sustainable investing, we know climate-aligned investing, we know infrastructure investing, which is II, ESG investing, climate-aligned investing, low-carbon investing. There's also climate mitigation investing, climate adaptation investing, energy infrastructure investing. So there can be many labels here, but at the end of the day, we're really talking about the same key issues. I want to focus a little bit on the green bond market and its potential to harness capital in a for-profit format, and when blended with other sources of capital, it has the potential to really channelize projects in capital into projects which create not only economic benefits but non-economic benefits that we're going to talk about. As a market, this has evolved. It was non-existent in 2007 when a group of multilaterals started to issue green bonds, essentially to provide investors an opportunity to get exposure on emerging market sustainable projects. These institutions were essentially acting as intermediaries. The credit risk that the green bond investors took were the risk on these institutions' balance sheets. So if it's the World Bank, it's the AAA balance sheet of the World Bank. So there was very little credit risk, but the investor drew comfort from the fact that it was the World Bank's origination and the underwriting process that would ensure that the capital found its way into climate-aligned projects. These projects by themselves were not capable of standing on their own. creditworthiness, and hence they needed an intermediary like a World Bank to channelize capital flows. Since then, the market has evolved, and what is interesting is it has evolved more along the lines of certain definitions that are still very loose. The standards are loose. So one question that often comes up to, will green bonds address the climate change challenge? The answer is clearly no. And so I would just maybe spend a couple of minutes more on this, and then they'll come to the green bond market quickly. So as a larger universe of climate-aligned bonds, we're looking at about $1 trillion and a half that consist of, if you look at the 2018 and 2017 bars here, the top is the green bond, which are labeled green bonds. And then there are the other categories which fall within the broader category of climate aligned. And the climate alignment, very simplistically, is being measured based on what is the proportion of green revenues as part of that issuer revenue base, which, as you can see, there are flaws in that. But that's how the market has evolved. I know the U.S. muni space is a big focus of this discussion, and I'm going to touch on that a little bit. But U.S. munis account for a very large, significantly a large portion of this. But very quickly, I'm going to go forward. This is some of the broader sectors that we have seen, which if you fall on any of the buckets here, then you are green. So that's the nature of the market. It doesn't really matter whether the capital raise is being put to use to create climate or green outcomes. But if you fall, for example, for example, a question often comes, if you're renewables, are you automatically green? The answer is clearly no, because there are other sustainability considerations that come into picture. Some of the areas that are still developing, which are considered part of sustainable infra, and the current thinking is that if you take the proceeds and put them in a ring-fenced account and go and invest, you would be considered a green issuer. The key challenge here comes is that you are, as an investor, you're still taking the credit risk or the risk on the main entity which is issuing the bonds, whether it's a muni, it's a corporate, or it's a multilateral. And so one of the challenges that we have often found, some of these green projects tend to be small, and really the question is about how do you aggregate them into a vehicle that can then issue green bonds to some of the larger investors for scale and efficiency reasons. From a very high level, while green bonds have a huge potential, if we map the green label bonds and the climate aligned bond, it's roughly about $1.5 trillion type of universe that currently exists. Now that pales in comparison to over what is said to be $100 trillion fixed income market, or maybe larger, the numbers vary. It's really small. And so it has yet not become an asset class, which really speaks about the potential it has in terms of attracting more fixed income investors to the asset class. So where the innovation is needed, I think issuers, especially small issuers who don't have the credit capacity, they cannot issue green bonds. So there have been some innovation around bundling credit capacity in a way that can, or cross-collateralizing number of projects in a way, then you can issue green bonds. I think the example, I had an interesting discussion with the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank, and it's really the kind of model we need. We need to still expand the range of issuers. The issuers are very constrained. There are fewer issuers in the green bond market, more project-type issuers, so you can monetize the economic streams. You're not dependent on the credit risk of the municipality or the utility, as the case may be. And then I think the bigger issue is really developing green pipelines, which is still a challenge in a lot of the markets or segments. The green pipelines, project preparation and others, and the early stage capital and the push that is needed to get them off the ground, which is where grant making in the context of public projects or early stage venture in the case of private projects become relevant. And last but not least, I think the market has to grow. I think it will grow. There would be retail investors can invest in green bond markets, and that's the solution. I'm not going to go jump into that. And this is kind of a lot of the discussion here around the need for the trillions of dollars we need for climate-aligned financing. This analysis was done a year ago by BNEF and our research, but the recent IPCC conclusions they require a much greater volume of dollars. I think with that, I'm going to stop. If there's any question, I can take them now or later.
We'll take them later, I think. So we can have the rest of the panel come up. And I apologize for the temperature in the room. overview of what's happening with private investment in infrastructure in many areas and how sustainable investing is coming up more and more as a feature. What we wanted to do now is kind of move through a couple of different products and product areas and questions before we open it up more widely. And Ben, Anadi talked about measurable benchmarked impacts. Does that have anything to do with what you're working on?
A little bit, yeah. First, I'd start off by saying it's great to be back here at FES. I graduated in 2017, so it's good to be back in Croon eating coffee sandwiches, although it's a little bit weird still to be on this side of a talk at Burke. So Quantified Ventures, we're an impact investment intermediary firm that specializes in outcomes-based financing, notably environmental impact bonds, social impact bonds. And so we heard Paula mention before that green infrastructure to date has still been primarily implemented by a small pool of early adopters and innovators. We heard Jeff earlier mention that access to capital is still a need for resilient infrastructure investments. And we just heard Anadi refer to some of the challenges with labeling and measurability of green bonds. And we think that the impact bonds or pay for success approach is a way to, or is one way to help mitigate some of those challenges. And the general structure of what an impact bond looks like, particularly in the environmental space, we're also working in public health, but in the environmental space, typically we're structuring these investments as municipal bonds, as actual municipal debt. So there is a set interest rate that's paid on the bond, but then layered on top of that is a performance payment mechanism, wherein if projects are performing better than expected by some predetermined environmental or social or health or economic metric, then issuers pay an additional performance payment for that upside environmental or social performance. But that's compensated for underperforming projects or base performing projects either through a reciprocal clawback payment that's made from investors to the issuer, or it can be structured as a discount on the interest rate that they continue to pay off the bond at as compared to if they were issuing a traditional investment. And so what that can do is that for issuers, typically we work with city and state governments. For issuers that are interested in impactful, innovative interventions like green infrastructure, other forms of resilient infrastructure, but they're concerned about how those projects are going to perform. It can help hedge some of that performance risk and incentivize them to experiment with things like green infrastructure and those kinds of projects. And for the measurability aspects, there's necessarily, to determine performance, there's necessarily a evaluation and measurement program that's part of every impact bond that we structure. So for the investors, they know that the projects that they're investing in achieved X amount of volume of stormwater capture, for example. So it also helps tap into the growing base of impact investors who are interested in putting their capital into projects that produce these kinds of environmental and social outcomes. And so it may seem odd at first why issuers would have to pay more for projects that are achieving higher performance, but really the basis for this is an economic logic where higher performance is associated with either cost savings or other forms of benefits that accrue to the city. And what's been really interesting is we have closed or are closing 3 different environmental impact bonds to finance green infrastructure for stormwater management. And they all sort of have different motivations and different definition of performance and a different economic logic behind it. So the impact bond that we closed working with DC Water, the Water and Sewer Authority there for green infrastructure, that was really motivated by regulatory obligations. They had a consent decree with the EPA to manage their combined sewer overflows, and they were using it to pilot 25 acres of green infrastructure to see if they can, to see how much green infrastructure they would need to replace one of the large gray infrastructure stormwater tunnels that they had planned as part of a $2.6 billion capital improvement plan with green infrastructure. So really they're interested in the cost effectiveness of green infrastructure to manage stormwater and how much money that they would need to spend for the whole plan to finish meeting their consent decree obligations. With the city of Atlanta, which is the deal that I'm working on most directly right now, there's no, unlike DC Water, there's no sort of regulatory push factor. The city of Atlanta had a consent decree with EPA. They've mostly met their obligations already. They've done a lot of combined sewer separation. But the green infrastructure projects there, instead of being focused on CSOs, they're really focused on mitigating issues of local flooding and water quality issues in low-income, economically depressed neighborhoods. There's 6 different projects. They're all concentrated in a few neighborhoods on the west side of the city. It's also downstream of the city center, so a lot of the stormwater challenges sort of tend to concentrate there. And so they're issuing an environmental impact bond to help also better understand what is the impact of green infrastructure in neighborhoods like this in Atlanta to mitigate these local water quality and flooding issues, but also to improve access to green space, create new green jobs for ongoing maintenance of the green infrastructure projects. Some of them are also targeted at increased mobility throughout the city. One of them will be connected to a larger green beltline project that's underway in the city of Atlanta. So it's motivated by those social equity concerns and rather than a regulatory push factor. In Baltimore, there is a regulatory push factor, but unlike with DC Water, it's not driven by, there's nothing in the regulatory environment for the Baltimore DPW that specifies a certain volume of stormwater that needs to be achieved. They're on the hook to help control nutrient runoff into the Patapsco River and then the Chesapeake Bay. But the regulatory context there is that they get credit for that just by implementing practices with nothing in there stating in particular that they need to be measuring the amount of stormwater that's captured. So rather than, unlike DC Water in Atlanta where it's based on volume, really what Baltimore cares about is, well, if we're doing all these green infrastructure projects, how do we predict or how do we know what our ongoing costs are going to be for maintenance? And it turns out one of the biggest cost factors that they've identified in their projects is ongoing plant viability, how well the plants are able to survive year after year, what does it cost to maintain the same level of vegetation or to plant new plants. So better understanding that economic logic is the driver for the green infrastructure project in Baltimore. And so we've also heard a lot about how do you value and monetize co-benefits or future benefits, and that's really the approach that we take with all of the investments that we help structure. And we try to take a very holistic view to value the economic benefits and some of these positive externalities that we know come from these projects. And in some cases, it allows us to get creative with who is on the hook for paying back a bond. And so an example of this is we had been working with the U.S. Forest Service and with a service provider in Baltimore that deconstructs vacant homes with the idea that deconstruction, as opposed to just demolishing vacant homes, creates there's a greater labor need, but that also creates opportunities for ongoing employment. And we know that there's a huge issue with vacant properties in Baltimore that also leads to some of the crime and public health impacts that Michelle was talking about before. And so our original hypothesis was the Maryland State Department of Housing and Community Development would be the primary beneficiary of using an impact bond to scale up this program. But what we found is that as we were doing the economic valuation that we do, again, as part of every project that we do, we also found that a lot of the monetizable benefits from these projects would also accrue to the State Department of Labor and the State Department of Public Safety and Corrections, because this program was specifically targeting former offenders or people who were formerly incarcerated. And in reducing recidivism, that reduces the costs to manage state prisons. So we got 3 different departments in a room together talking about how to share costs and benefits of a potential impact bond to scale this up. And I'll just highlight one more example of that. Back on closer to the natural infrastructure space, we've been working with EDF and the State Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority in Louisiana. The CPRA just issued their most recent coastal master plan last year that identifies $50 billion worth of projects to restore the coast of Louisiana and help mitigate sea level rise and continued encroachment. Of that $50 billion, a lot of it is allocated for for wetland restoration. But to date, of the 50, they've only identified around $21 billion of available public funding to help support the project. So where's the remainder of the funding for those projects going to come from? An idea that we're exploring there is since we know that coastal restoration and wetland restoration projects, they also benefit a number of private sector actors that are active along the coast of Louisiana. There's a ton of, obviously, oil and gas, but also fishing, shipping industry. Can we incentivize those private sector actors to also share in some of the costs of financing these projects through a performance-based bond where they're only paying based on can we demonstrate that there are benefits directly accruing to them and demonstrate that it's cheaper to help pay for coastal restoration and wetland restoration now than it would be to pay for post-disaster recovery at your commercial or industrial oil and gas or other site. So we're really excited about the potential that this kind of instrument can unlock.
That's great. Thank you so much. So you moved from green bonds, money going into something that may or may not be green, to bonds where you actually track the performance to see how it's doing. And then Ricardo Encourage has been one of the groups that has been doing some of the earliest experimentation about whether there are equity opportunities around particularly green stormwater infrastructure. And maybe you could talk a little bit about what you learned through that and where your work's headed now.
Yeah, not a lot. Thanks so much for being here. I know that it's the last minute of the last hour on a Friday night, so I was expecting just to have a conversation with like 4 people on the panel with everybody gone. So thanks for being hardcore about financing. Appreciate that. As much as I would love to have a conversation with Brad and the panelists, it's going to be more fun, I hope, with you guys out there. So just a word about Encourage. We're an impact investment firm, but the way we approach impact investing is slightly different. So whereas you see a lot of people out there who come at it from an asset class approach and they say, I do venture capital, or I do private equity, or I do public equity, how do I layer impact into it? Encourage kind of starts the other way around, and we look at it from what is the impact you want to have, and how do you deploy finance to achieve that impact in a way that is both good for society and for the environment, and also provides returns to investors. So what we do is we tend to analyze issues and problems and then look for ways that finance can provide a solution to that. So we've done work on fisheries, we've done work on agriculture, we did a big study on water called Liquid Assets. I know, terrible pun, but never mind. And it was really about the Western United States and drought in the Western United States and how could you invest in a way that makes a return to address the issues of water problems in the Western U.S. That identified about 12 ideas or opportunities around water in the West. We then decided, and this was funded by the Walton Foundation, who kind of came to us and said, look, we've been spending tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in philanthropy to address water in the Western United States, but we know no amount of philanthropy is going to solve that problem. We need private capital in here, and how do we bring private capital to address that problem? This report is totally public. You can go out and read it if you need something to put you to sleep. It's 400 pages. There's some good ideas in there. Just read the summary. I won't be annoyed. And out of those 12 ideas, we sort of took 2 that we then are trying to raise capital around. One of them has to do with agriculture and investment in agriculture to address water problems. And the other one's the one I really want to focus on here, which is about municipal green infrastructure finance. So that just gives you a sense of how we approach problems. The idea on green infrastructure was, again, to see how we could bring private capital to bear. And eventually I'll get to answering Brad's question, but down the line. And when we approached municipalities, we had a number of ideas in there, you know, including things like a fire resilience bond, which actually was launched yesterday, including, you know, environmental impact bonds, like what we heard about just a minute ago. And so we started approaching a variety of municipalities, largely in the West, and saying, we know you have stormwater issues. We know you would like to do more green infrastructure. And a lot of the cities we were approaching knew about green infrastructure, had actually financed green infrastructure, would like to do more, but we kind of found that they weren't doing more, and for a variety of reasons and different reasons. And we tried to tease out where would really be an important role for private capital. And the one big issue you have to deal with when you do that is the fact that you can separate probably municipalities in the United States into two categories. One category is those that have high credit rating and are, you know, usually big cities and well-financed cities. These cities have access to the cheapest capital in the world through tax finance, right? So you can't come in as a private investor and offer them, you know, a solution that asks them to pay more for that capital. They'll laugh you out of the room, and many of them did. And they sort of said, no, we don't want private capital. We've got all kinds of access to capital at really cheap rates. So that's one category. The other category are the smaller municipalities usually, who are not very well financed, who don't have good credit rating. There's a lot you can do there. But just coming back to the big municipalities, the only way to skin that cat is to approach it slightly differently and to sort of say, okay, it's not about the capital. It's not about us providing you with cheap capital because we can't compete with the capital you have access to. So what makes the private capital different? And the environmental impact bond is an approach to that, and the way I characterize it in my head is that you are providing services around risk for the municipality. You're telling the municipality, you know, for instance, in the deal you did with DC Water, you're saying to them, look, there's a risk that you will put in the green infrastructure and it will either underperform or overperform or perform, right? We will take on, as private capital, some of the risk that it will underperform. And therefore, if it underperforms, you pay us less interest. But if it overperforms, you know, we'll take on that risk for a price. And that price is that if it overperforms, you will pay us a little bit more in interest than you would normally. And there are municipalities under consent decrees and other places that, for a variety of reasons, this is a good solution. And I think it's great that Quantified Ventures is doing that work, because there are a lot of places in this country where we need to do that, and that's going to solve a ton of financing issues for green infrastructure. And this is a novel approach, and it's a great approach, and there's a lot of places that want to do that. There's also a lot of places that have told us, we're not interested in paying for that risk management. We know green infrastructure works. We've done the analyses. We've done the studies. We don't need to pay for that risk management. Our problem, and this is, you know, we heard this from the city of San Francisco, who we're working with, our problem is that when we did green infrastructure, it tends to cost more per gallon of water managed than our traditional gray infrastructure. So if we're going to scale this up, we've got a problem. And then you start digging as to why it costs more, and it's because they have public works, which is a huge department designed to do multi-billion-dollar projects, putting in bioswales, right? It's like asking the Battlestar Galactica to cut butter. It's not a good use of that mechanism, right? So of course it's going to be expensive. That's one reason. The other thing you tell them is, hey, there's all these great co-benefits for health, for transportation, for all these other things. And they tell you, we don't care about those co-benefits. In our charter, it's about water. We have to deliver water. So we said to them, well, there are other people who care about those co-benefits. Can we get them to pay? Can we create a structure where you bring together a variety of different agencies in the city to pay for that green infrastructure to deliver those multiple benefits. And what we did is we looked out into the world where was something like this being done, and there is a structure called the Joint Powers Authority, which allows different communities and different jurisdictions to band together, create an entity, issue debt, to work together to build infrastructure. So we said, cool, could we do something like that within a city, in the same jurisdiction? Could we create a joint benefits authority that was looking at the various benefits that were being derived from these projects? And they were like, yeah, that would be great. And the only way to do that is to get ahead of the capital planning process in the municipality to say, before transportation starts with its capital plan, before the water agency does that, parks or anybody else, get them to sit in a room to jointly capital plan around some of these projects, right? So we've now started a process with San Francisco to try to create a pilot joint benefits authority, the first of its kind like that there, that could legally issue debt potentially. So what this looks like in theory, and this is a hypothesis, and it may not work, and it will be difficult, and it will take a long time, because one of the things we found out being from the private sector is that working with municipalities is difficult and slow. We wanted to do this as a sprint. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And so we have to tool and work on it like a marathon, and it'll take time. So the way this would work is to say, okay, if you were to manage this water with gray infrastructure, let's just make up a number and say it would cost you $70 a unit, right? With green infrastructure, it costs $100 a unit. But what if we could bring in transportation and they could put in $20 a unit? What if parks could put in $20 a unit? All of a sudden, you got $110 a unit. Now what you could actually do is go to the private sector, issue a bond, get the money up front, even get them to build it without going through public works, potentially, but there are labor and union issues, so this is part where it gets tricky. But, get somebody else to build it for $100, borrow that money and pay the investor the 10. So, making up the numbers, that's the hypothesis of how something like this could work. Hopefully we'll get to a pilot around that, but we think if that happens, that will have applicability all over the place. Not just in the US, all over the world, and could be a really, really cool structure to bring in private capital. Or it may be a cool structure that doesn't even need private capital and can access municipal bonds directly. Because totally, like Anadi said, there's going to be a tremendous amount of infrastructure built on the planet. What scared me silly was the statistic that said 75% of the infrastructure that will be on the planet in 50 years has yet to be built. Now, think of that. Think about what the next 50 years is going to bring in terms of environmental impact and infrastructure building, and the trillions of dollars that's going to go into that. And if we could just channel some portion of that trillion to doing it right, to doing it as green infrastructure, how important that would be. Now, finally, to answer Brad's question on equity mechanisms, there are many other mechanisms that we've explored around this. One of them has to do with stormwater credit trading. There are not a lot of places in the country that have created stormwater credit trading mechanisms, but one is Washington, D.C. They created a system where it's kind of like a carbon cap and trade, but for stormwater credits, right? Now, we knew, having worked in carbon, we have a carbon fund that is invested in carbon and made tremendous returns for our investors. We quadrupled their money. They couldn't believe it when we did that for them. They thought, this is an impact investment. I thought I was going to lose money. So we learned from the carbon markets that one of the problems with creating these credit trading systems is that when they're first created, the people who have carbon don't know they have carbon, don't know there's a buyer for carbon, and therefore don't do projects. The people who might buy the carbon don't know there's a market for carbon, and if they do, don't know where to buy it because there's nobody selling. So you need to prime that pump somehow. So we kind of talked to our partners at TNC, and we said to them, let's create a company to build stormwater credits to prime that market in Washington, D.C. And so we created a company called District Stormwater that's a joint venture with TNC. We got money from Prudential to finance that company, and that company has built some of the first stormwater credit projects in Washington, D.C., and has sold some of the first stormwater credit projects in Washington, D.C. We think that's great, and would be, pilot for other stormwater credit trading systems around the country. Problem is, we're not seeing a whole lot of other places build stormwater credit trading systems. They take time to build. They'll take 2 to 3 years to build, because you need the rules. It took DC 3 years at least to build the rules around how this credit trading system would work. Hopefully, more will do it, but we actually like this idea of the Joint Benefits Authority as a concept, and we're going to pilot it in in San Francisco. We're talking to Los Angeles, and part of it is that, we have a ton of agencies in most municipalities and cities that are not working together. It's nice to talk about One Water, but you have a city like Los Angeles that has, LA Sanitation managing the wastewater, another agency managing drinking water, and then you have Metropolitan Water District overseeing, a bunch of different things, and never mind transportation. But even within water, you have at least 3 to 10 agencies, if you include the county, LA County, looking at water, and with different incentive mechanisms. So LA Sanitation gets paid on throughput through the sewer system. So if you go to them with a green infrastructure project that says, I'm going to reduce throughput through the sewer system, they go, well, it's not, maybe we should look at something else, right? So the systems are wrong, and we need to figure out some way to make these systems a little bit more coherent and more comprehensive, and that's a problem not just in green infrastructure, but everywhere. But I do think that we're going to need to rethink how we deliver the trillions of dollars of infrastructure that's coming down the pike. And that means dealing not just with where the money's going to come from, and I was really heartened to hear all of the great work that's happening in Rhode Island and other places to kind of bundle and stack capital from grants, federal money, public, private money. But we're going to have to change the way we manage these agencies and these departments in a deeper way. And I think private capital can be a catalyst for change. Because like when we approached San Francisco, they were like, yeah, we would love to partner with other agencies. But we can't go to the mayor and say, force transportation to work with us. And transportation is not going to open their kimono and show us their maps and their capital plans. But if there's a third party, a catalyst, as it were, that gets us all in a room together, and if there's the prospect of private money potentially at the end of the day, yeah, that could work. So I think that that's kind of a direction for bringing in private capital, or it may just be a direction for greater coherence at the municipal level. I'll leave it at that, Brent.
Thank you very much. Anadi, after your wonderful introduction, do you have any comments on what you heard from Ben and Rodrigo, or are there areas you're excited about seeing develop?
I take a global lens and see some of the challenges in other markets and some of our experience in investing.
Can you come closer to your mic again? Sorry.
Generally, in our investing, we have taken a global lens in terms of thinking about these issues, and we see similar challenges across many markets. I think cities, municipalities face the same challenge of not being creditworthy, not having enough funds, and they have come up with different models. I think I'm interested in kind of learning and seeing, because one of the hypotheses that we made is that some of the benefits that are non-economic are likely to be priced not just by other departments within the city, but also the emerging universe of investors that value impact. So you can create different structures where you can create one blend of capital stack, or you can stage capital in a way that time things in to bring a combination. So the impact capital comes in first, is taken out by other forms of capital as the metrics are met, or you can have impact capital that is taking a higher degree of risk and providing a coupon to more private investors who are on top of the capital stack. I think there is a larger level of interest on part of impact investors. Now, if you're able to create an economic entity that is giving you enough economic benefits and you can probably catalyze multiple sources of capital. So really the challenge becomes how do you, band together these projects so that the resulting economic profile can bring in the least cost of capital and you can maximize the volume. So ultimately, really the question is, we see a lot of capital sources with different motivations and interest, and then blending them together and creating what is a de-risked, optimally risked solution.
Ricardo, can I come back to you for a second, just on impact investing and what Anadi was just talking about? You say the impact investors, whoa, we're expecting to lose money. What are you seeing in the market now in terms of expected financial rates of return on the back of impact, and is it a risk there? They have greater risk tolerance, so you could go where Anadi was suggesting, or is there even more room to maneuver?
I mean, I think there's some room to maneuver. I was being a little facetious. I mean, I think that there is indeed a myth out there that has been out there for some time that the moment you say you're an impact investor, you're going to get below market rate returns. And that's what I was alluding to. I think that is a myth. You can get below market rate returns, but you don't have to get below market rate
And you
returns.
can get below market rates of returns on traditional
investments. Totally, exactly. But you talk to traditional investors and you say impact investment, in their minds that translates into below market rate returns, and we have to change that. And I frankly don't think that will change until there's a generational change in the investment community where there's a new generation of investors out there. But it'll change eventually. There's a growing amount of impact investors, so I think there's a tremendous amount of room to maneuver. I don't think you can really, classify them well, because one impact investor, one impact investor. They're all really different. I have been a little disheartened, honestly, at the level of risk-taking in the impact investing community and even in the foundation community. So foundations have the ability to invest through what are known as program-related investments and mission-related investments. The program-related investments come from their program. The mission-related investments come from their endowment. There's very few that are taking money from the endowment. Most are taking program-related investments. And you would think that if there was a source of high-risk capital that is willing to take risks to make the world a better place, this is society's risk capital. I haven't seen them really taking on some of those risks. So I think it'll come, but it hasn't happened yet. I do think in the impact investment world, we are seeing a little bit of a bifurcation here, where you're getting the very big entities, the Goldman Sachs, BlackRocks, and the big traditional investors of the world dipping their toes in impact investing or socially responsible, or all those acronyms you put up there, Anadi, because their clients are demanding it. And like green bonds, I think their approach to impact is, call it maybe in some cases impact light, may not be as green as you and I would like. And they're sucking a ton of oxygen out of the room. Because traditional institutional investors, they will look at these, at Goldman Sachs and BlackRock and those things, and they go, I'm not going to get fired for putting money in with Goldman Sachs, even if they lose money, right? But put money with an unknown like Encourage Capital or Quantified Ventures, that's a little too risky for my blood, right? And then on the other side, you have a ton of NGOs setting up financing outfits. TNC has one, EDF is looking at it. There's a bunch of NGOs, and they are very impact-oriented, and in some cases below market rate return. So the really strong impact folks go here. The really less strong impact folks who just want the Goldman Sachs name go there. But I think the future of investing, of all investing, is right smack down the middle. And so we're trying to survive until that time comes.
Cool. So Ben, your products are aimed at impact investors. Who's buying? Which bucket?
Yeah, I'd say it's a mix. So the DC Water EIB that was sold in a private placement was bought mostly by Goldman Sachs' Urban Investment Group, which is an impact group within Goldman Sachs that focuses, or that has a strong focus on impact bonds, as well as by Calvert Impact Capital, formerly Calvert Foundation. But I'd say it's a range. I think we're coming up to some of the same challenges that Ricardo was just mentioning, in terms of like hurdle rates and risk appetite from more mainstream institutional investors. However, we have found that some fixed income desks like this form of debt because rather than returns being speculative based on the credit rating of the issuer or more macroeconomic issues, the return is based on the environmental or social performance of the project. So by including that in a portfolio, it's a different kind of risk and can help diversify that portfolio. But then we've also heard from other fixed income investors who, because this is, it's sort of a unique asset class in that it's debt that acts a little bit like equity, in that there can be different possible returns depending on whether that performance payment is made or what direction it's coming in, that don't like the fact that there's that uncertainty there and would prefer something where, you know, like a traditional bond where you're just getting paid out at a certain rate. So we're still sort of testing the market. Atlanta will be the first one that will do not as a private placement, that'll be a limited public offering, and we're targeting a lot of institutionals, but also family foundations, particularly foundations that are active in the Atlanta area, as well as potentially regional banks that require CRA credits.
Yeah, huge opportunities around regional investors, it feels like. So last question for you, Jen, this just quick response. Some of the earlier presentations made me wonder, we're seeing environmental impact bonds around stormwater flows, we're seeing social impact bonds around recidivism rates. Are you seeing any demand for performance criteria for health and nature for coming up yet, or is that a future market?
Yeah, definitely. As I mentioned, we do have a team at Quantified Ventures that focuses on the health space. I wish I could talk more intelligently about some of the projects that they're working on, but I know that I can give an example of one of the projects that they're working on with Meals on Wheels, where again it's rooted in that economic logic of, you know, having a service like Meals on Wheels coming to people's houses, providing nutrition. If that it's cheaper to pay for a program like that than it is to pay for hospitalization or treatment of people afterwards. And then we're also really interested in sort of the nexus of health and the environment, and in these green infrastructure bonds, even though the payment will be based on a metric associated with environmental metrics like volume capture or plant survivability, things like that. Again, as part of the economic model that we're building to price what the performance payment should be, we're also including in some of those broader health considerations as well.
Cool. Well, we look forward to seeing that offering. I think we have mics going around. Any questions from anybody for our panel? David?
Are any of your clients or funds looking at opportunity zones, and how do you see that dovetailing to the investments that you're making?
Could either one of you define opportunity zone for the audience?
Yeah, I can give the short answer. Basically, it was part of the federal tax legislation, and there are census tracts designated throughout the country. There are 72 in Connecticut, and if you reinvest your capital gains into projects within those, well, via opportunity funds into those geographies, and as long as you cycle them through to projects for 10 years, a minimum of 10 years, you forego all capital gains tax on those gains. So it's a pretty significant, very, very, very significant benefit for equity investors in a whole range of infrastructure and real estate projects and potentially businesses, although there are limitations in terms of the footprint of the businesses related to opportunity zones that probably steer it more towards infrastructure and real estate.
Yeah, so we are seeing a ton of interest in it, and you know, for a while there, our phones were ringing off the hook with people saying, "Do you have anything? Do you have anything? Can you give us anything?" Problem is, you know, the details of that legislation actually are just starting to come out, so nobody quite yet knew exactly how it was going to play out. I think it was maybe in the last month or so or less that that some of the details are emerging around how that's going to work. I think you're going to see a ton of money going into some of these opportunity zones and a ton of structures being created to channel money into there. I would love to see green infrastructure projects be a part of those opportunities. You know, we also, there's a few rural opportunity zones, so there might be opportunities to do some of the stuff that Brad has been looking at over many years, you know, with forestry investments and this kind of stuff that was done through New Markets tax credits, which was a similar structure aimed at rural poverty areas. So I think we're going to see a lot more in that space, but it's so new that we're just starting to see it. But investors are calling us saying we want to invest in this. We're getting a few people saying we're trying to create, you know, funds to take advantage of that interest. So I have no doubt that you'll see more and more of it.
Anadi, I know you work, you know, in many different parts of the world. Can you talk a little bit about the role of tax incentives in terms of attracting private investors into infrastructure? Is the U.S. really weird and we're the only place that does that? Or
I think our focus for a recent fund was Latin America, and we're looking at some of the emerging markets where municipal markets don't exist, quite frankly. In fact, the local capital markets are also not deep, and so there is not much.
Sorry, I did keep doing this to you.
Yeah, compared to the US, where there is a very large liquid municipal market, we don't see such markets prevalent in other geographies. And that's part of the challenge why infrastructure capital is difficult to mobilize. We are seeing innovation there, newer ways to stimulate local green markets or green capital markets through securitization and others, but those are still in a kind of emerging mode.
And you want to add anything? Or? Okay. Other questions? Yep. Question over here. Do we have a mic traveling on this side of the room? Okay, great, thanks.
So cities, states, universities are little city states, and you know we've seen such great momentum through the LEED rated system like this building, but we really don't see a systemic approach to green infrastructure on campuses, and you know. But universities have a fair amount of money, and they're a safe and long-term investment. And in many cities, they're a core of an urban development or sustainability strategy for a neighborhood. Can you talk about, you know, advancing systemic green infrastructure in universities and how that might impact municipal funding?
I can start. I don't know if Dawn's still in the room. I don't think so. So in New Haven, Dawn and Giovanni were here from the city engineer's office because we have a really strong working relationship with them, both as a school in that our students are really interested in green infrastructure as a possible part of their career paths going forward. But also as a university and as a citizen of New Haven, because we share the flooding problems that the rest of the city shares, and thinking about how best to address those makes a lot of sense to figure out how to work together on that. And Colleen's group at URI has been doing a lot of work in that regard. Clearly, the engineers department is prioritizing locations and activities based on where the greatest vulnerability is and where the most accessible capital is for projects, and has done, in the Regional Water Pollution Authority has done a lot of expansion of pipes and sort of more traditional infrastructure. The city of New Haven is doing more with green infrastructure, and the region is learning from that. I think, so the answer is it's an active partnership that still has a fair amount of work to do. I'm just thinking here about whether any of my colleagues to my left would have investment opportunities around any of those programs. There's certainly opportunities to donate philanthropic capital to Yale's campaign, but I'm not sure there are many investment opportunities because Yale does not issue bonds all that often, although it does so sometimes.
What's actually interesting is that there is a certain other Ivy League university to the north that was once referred to as a large hedge fund with a small university attached to it. The description of which could apply
Sure.
more or less to Yale. So, you also have a very big investment arm in the university, and so I think that there might be ways to tap into some of that investment potential. And we know in some of the stuff we've been doing, not in municipal infrastructure, but at least some of the university endowments have come in with investments and are dabbling with impact investing to some degree. So, but I do think there could be projects. We just have to figure out, as Jeff said, in terms of a lot of these projects, what you have to figure out is where the source of revenue is. And what always annoys me about the term green bonds is that you talk to an investor and all they hear about is the bond portion of that phrase, and they focus on that and forget the green. When you talk to environmental organizations, all they hear about is the green portion of it, and they forget that this is a bond that has to be repaid. And they go like, couldn't my project just be a green bond? And it's like, well, how are you going to pay back the bond? You mean I have to pay it back? Yes. So as long as we find how you can pay that money back on the projects, and we find that source of revenue, I think we can come up with lots of creative ways to invest in university infrastructure.
When we think about different sources of financing for land conservation, we think about investors motivated by love, by care, and by cash flows. And the cash flows part is the hardest for the NGOs.
Yeah.
Question? Oh, did you want to weigh in, Ben?
Yeah, I would just add that a third role that at least we see in our work, particular to impact bonds that we see for universities, is again, because there's an evaluation and measurement that's done as part of every impact bond. We have been working with universities to potentially play the role of an evaluator and provide a research opportunity and measure the impact from these projects.
Question over here. Hang on just a second, because we're still live streaming, I think, so that folks can hear the question.
Thank you. We understand from previous discussion also that public funding will be a challenge in going future. What is your perception on the private funding and how it will unfold in the next couple of years and decades for its investment into green infrastructure?
Who would like to start? I think you probably have 4 different opinions, but I could be
I can
wrong.
give a kind of general response. In our experience, we found capital to not be a problem, or it's not, the volume of the capital is really access to pipelines and investable opportunities and creating those pipelines.
Nadi?
I'm sorry.
My usual, sorry.
Sorry. In our experience and what we have learned in talking to their investors and seeing how they're thinking about their investment allocations, capital is not a problem. The problem is about creating investable opportunities where they can get a balance of return, risk, and impact. And I think that's where the bottlenecks are. So could there be private funding available to fill that gap? The answer is absolutely yes. I think the challenge is how do you, more on the upstream side, create those opportunities?
How do you develop the projects?
Yeah, I think that's totally right. I do think there is a really bright future for private capital in this space. I mean, you have to also realize that municipal bonds and municipal debt has been a huge part of where private capital has gone in the past and will continue to be. I think the challenge isn't to bring in private capital. The challenge is to find how to use private capital in a creative and innovative way to drive more sustainable solutions and approaches to the infrastructure that's going to be built. But there's going to be trillions of dollars of infrastructure built, and there is an incredibly growing amount of impact investors out there of all stripes and colors who are looking for investable opportunities that have those qualities. Just to give you a sense, we did a study with JP Morgan, TNC, and others on conservation finance, and what we found was, to find out how much they had invested in conservation finance. What we found was roughly $2 billion had been invested, but we asked these investors, and they had roughly $2 billion sitting in their pockets that they had not invested, but that they had raised in order to invest. So if you know anything about private capital, you know that that is literally burning a hole in their pocket. That is driving down their returns if they are sitting on that capital. So you have to ask yourself, why did they not invest that $2 billion? And we asked them, and they said, we could not find the projects. Just another way of saying money is not the problem. The money is out there. It's the projects that pay back that money that are there. And I think institutional investors are going to be particularly interested in this space because they like investing with municipals and they like debt products. They're used to them and they like them.
So maybe just to reframe that a little bit, it's not so much that money's not the problem, it's that there's a bunch of money looking for profitable investments, but you can't find projects where either the taxpayers or the consumers, whatever, or however one defines those consumers, can afford the cash flows needed to make that an attractive investment.
And it's not so much afford, but
Well,
are willing to allocate it.
Yeah, whatever.
It's not so much the payment rate, but it's also how do you create really what is an investment. So there are institutional voids that you see in a very general response in different markets where there is just not enough structure there for that idea to move across to reach what is then an investable opportunity.
So is this a stormwater trading credit that people don't know, or that the institution, there aren't either private sector or public sector institutions to make the project happen on the ground, should the investment be made?
It's all of the above, I would think.
And you know, just like this conference that tries to bring the technical, the operational, and the finance, we go to talk to utilities, and there's almost a Chinese wall between the financial side of the utilities house and the technical side of the utilities house. So I think there is actually a tremendous amount of education, training, capacity building that needs to happen within utilities into how do you actually understand finance, understand innovative finance, and understand different ways that we're talking about here to do this work.
And that's one of the benefits, I think, of TNC's collaboration with Dow, is having the ecologists talk to the engineers to develop sort of cost-benefit models that then fit the financing models within at least the corporate sphere. Ben, did you want to comment on any of this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that a lack of pipeline is a big barrier to actually deploying that private capital. Also wanted to add that I think one direction that private investment is going, when we're talking about impact investors, I think they are getting more and more sophisticated about the actual environmental and social impact of what they're doing. And all these green bond principles and ESG metrics are continually being revisited and iterated on, and investors are more knowledgeable now, and will continue to be more knowledgeable about or be able to decipher what is real impact or what is impact related to issues that they care about. I also do tend to agree with Ricardo that I think a lot of so-called impact investors are still not maybe as risk forward as they should be to really help catalyze this market. I think part of the problem is that, you know, since this market of impact investing, conservation finance started, it was started with the promise that you'll be able to still achieve, you know, the same level of financial returns with the same amount of risk, but also achieve an environmental return. I think that's I'm not convinced that that's really feasible for a lot of projects where even if there is a source for repayment, they're still investable, but it may not be necessarily the same level or the same level as what they may be traditionally investing in.
Maybe you have time for one last question, if anybody has one. If not, maybe you could join me in thanking our panelists. So just to let you know, we learned last night or the night before that our closing speaker was incredibly ill and not going to be able to join us. So we're doing a slight bait and switch. Colleen and I are going to offer some themes that we've heard, sort of themes with some hopefully actionable elements. And I'm going to ask Colleen to start. And then we'd like to open it up for your thoughts on themes or ideas that you see as potentially actionable, because I think this has been a really unusual conference, as Ben just said, you know, cutting across the science and the operation and the finance. And hopefully it's generated some new ideas, and we want to capture those. The only thing I would say is we'd ask people to keep their ideas to 30 seconds or less, so that we can get as many ideas from the group as possible. Colleen, you want to start?
Yeah, so to get us started, first I'll say we're sad that Murley wasn't able to be here, and we'll do our best, but he's a great closer. Brad and I took on the task of closing in part because we were largely responsible for organizing the day. So I just also want to give my gratitude to Brad, who was, just a great lead on this day today. And for starting us off in the afternoon with defining equity that has more than one meaning, because there are many of us probably in this room that know more about the science or the operation than we do the afternoon on the finance. So it was good to start us that way. One of the key things that I took from the morning was that, and it was kind of repeated throughout the entire day, was the importance of integration. And in the morning, part of that conversation started around integration across the physical and the social. And it seems that the physical side, thinking about water and air, where we do have a helpful push from the regulatory side, that push might be in part due to, and I am carefully using the word somewhat easy, way to measure the physical side, that we have clearer metrics for measuring, for example, the volume of stormwater. Not to say that your work is easy, Gabe or Kim, that I know kind of measuring water quality and water volume from the green infrastructure can be difficult, but it's in some ways easier than being able to measure the social benefits. So that was one theme from the morning, of the challenge of trying to integrate the physical and the social benefits, and then the challenge of integrating across different siloed units, like Giovanni brought up the ability that they've had to cross from water to transportation in terms of integrating projects. We also heard a lot of the idea of being iterative, and Gerald talked about the importance of the feedback loop from the practitioner, from the operations side, and their experience and their massive scaled up approach of maintenance to give that feedback loop to the research side. But then it was kind of like the day just came together in the afternoon, when then even the finance guys could talk about, wait, that feedback loop also links to finance, that they need to be able to evaluate the investments and the return on investment, and to make those instruments effective, and to show what risk and benefit that they can bring to investors. So I found that those were, to me, the really large themes. And then on the social side, from Michelle Kondo and from Nushin this morning, the idea, actually there is quite a lot of evidence for the health benefit, and that they are able to start to bring that health sector resource to bear. When Michelle talked about the evidence that they were able to, with NIH funding, look at how greening impact on crime and on the kind of social determinants to help that you see, that they're actually able to, in Youngstown, Ohio, or in Philadelphia, demonstrate that they can bring evidence of those health impacts from greening. Though I would say, so for me, the day was very hopeful that that there is more integration, and there is a lot of iteration happening in this sphere. The one area that I'd say maybe was disheartening was when Nushin talked about the racism that still exists, and when she gave the example of the highway in California, the 880 traffic, that bringing in the diesel trucks that are creating air quality problems that are really affecting certain communities. And I think that we didn't talk about that area as much today. We talked some about the importance of helping people who are involved in green infrastructure as a pathway to new employment, both in the Power Core work that Gerald described, and also in the work in New Haven that we're involved in with Giovanni and Dawn. So I think that there's some of the social justice work is being integrated into this work, but that I think it's an area that there is so much work in our country to do, and that green infrastructure can be part of the solution. But I'm going to pass it back to Brad to talk much more on finance, because I really, I started to keep time in the afternoon because I was taking so many notes, because it sounded to me that I really realized that I'd forgotten to warn you guys on the time, so.
No worries. I guess a couple of thoughts. Mark Ashton, who's on the faculty here in forestry, and I started teaching courses on emerging markets for ecosystem services probably almost 20 years ago. And it feels like in the last 5, a lot of progress is being made, and that was sort of what I took away from the morning. Not to say that there isn't a lot more research that's needed, but there seems to be much broader acceptance and a larger number of case studies one could use going into a new city or a new department or a new financing institution and say, this is real. Certainly that's true in the health and nature area, where there are a variety of articles outlining the research needs to demonstrate at a medical level or the same level as you would do for a pharmaceutical what's happening. But as Nushin said, there's pretty wide acceptance that time in nature reduces stress, helps children's development, leads to more exercise, and can help build community or social cohesion, all of which are good for your health, so let's start doing it. So then you're starting to see more people doing it and having the kind of work that Quantified and Encourage are doing, and the fact that you have, you know, large financial institutions like Goldman and JP Morgan and others intrigued by this is really encouraging. And I note, I think John Tobin was in the room, but I think he just left. Oh, no, it's still here. When John was at Credit Suisse, as I understand the story, and you should correct me if I'm wrong, a number of Credit Suisse high net worth individual clients said, we want some sustainable land product in our portfolios. And Credit Suisse folks said, fine, and then sort of turned around and said, where do we get that? And the field has been building, in part because of John's and Credit Suisse and others' efforts to figure this out. So that sort of then takes me to the rock and the hard place part that we started to get to a little bit on the last panel, which is who is going to pay for this? And how much as a society are we going to value this and pay for this? You know, because the panel before the private finance panel was entirely around taxpayer money. So are we willing to pay taxes for any of this? Many of the co-benefits we're talking about are public benefits that are really hard to put in the market. So the public sector, it seems to me, should invest in those. That will come from fees or taxes as well. And then, you know, how much money are we willing to pay to have a house on the shore that's been elevated, or, you know, for our insurance payments? So there's some really interesting, difficult questions, I think, about what does this look like. But for me, if there are all these shared benefits and co-benefits, no matter how difficult they are to value, that suggests that actually that's a well-optimized investment. If you're not just getting one stream of value, but getting multiple streams of value. And if we can actually, I think Ricardo's work on the Joint Benefits Authority is really exciting, and sort of figuring out, let's use the models that Quantified has developed or Encourage has developed or others are developing to say who benefits from this piece of infrastructure, and then use that as the guide to whose door we should knock on and say, hey, if this is done, you benefit, and you benefit this much, and we'd like the check tomorrow, please. And, you know, not going to succeed all the time, but it strikes me as a really, really hopeful way to go. I think those are sort of my major ones.
Can we invite the audience to add your thoughts on ways forward or your big takeaways from today?
And can we have mics as well?
And we need to use the mic, otherwise people who are listening to the live webcast don't hear anything. So just
yes,
so
we got
you know.
one here. Yeah. And if we could have somebody work the mic on that side too, that would be great.
So we touched on the subject of blight a bit today. I think, though, it deserves, obviously, real conversation. Density is obviously key for the climate challenges that we face. There are some ways in which the economics of addressing the housing, the older housing in cities, it's just it's way complicated, and there are things that require technical innovations. Talk to me about my 1895 house that I'm trying to figure out how to put solar on. But I think the whole issue of blight and the lack of political motivation often in municipalities to really take it on, and kind of lack of money and technical support, it's complicated. And
where does that take you from an action point of view, or a possible action point of view?
Well, I think that there needs to be a conversation about that. I'll probably talk with Colleen about it more. Thanks.
Okay. Other thoughts? Dave? Sorry, if we could get Will, I don't know if there's somebody available back there for the other mic, but that would be great.
Yeah, thanks for the conference today. As I alluded to in my talk earlier, I came into this conference thinking it was really going to be primarily about financing, and then there were all these great talks about public health and vulnerable populations, which, coming from the Department of Housing, that's who we serve. Even though I'm the director of resilience and I work in disaster recovery, my funding is tied to serving low and moderate income communities as a requirement of statute. And so the more that I can address the resilience issues of flood risk, from stormwater and sea level rise and extreme weather events, but address these underlying chronic conditions of poverty, the better I'm serving the mission of my agency. But we certainly know from the climate change literature that those who are going to suffer the most from a changing climate are the most vulnerable populations, who are already straining under all these conditions in their communities. So it just hit that home to me. And I think you could have renamed the conference "The Intersection of Green Infrastructure and Vulnerable Populations" and how we can work together on that.
We thought about it.
So I learned a great deal today and was introduced to some literature that I hadn't seen before. So I look forward to future conversations on that issue.
Yeah, I think just building on that, I agree completely. If people have not looked at the social determinants of health literature, you might want to, particularly if you're from the environmental side. Basically, it says where you live is more important than almost anything else in your life in terms of its impact on your health, whether that's flood risk, whether that's poor air quality. Nushin basically captured it entirely in her presentation this morning. And that's what's interesting, the health sector. They're saying, well, we can have pay models that are based on, we get paid the most for the most treatments we give to sick people. But there are also models that are starting to emerge about we do better as a provider if we actually prevent people from getting sick. And it's a huge split in the health community, but you're seeing, particularly with costs going up so dramatically, more and more incentives to go in that direction. And then if you start digging into the neighborhoods, then you see all of the different kinds of things you're talking about vulnerable populations and where the health risks are and where the money's being spent. We have lots of questions now. So let's go. Lauren, pick one.
Hi, thank you, Gabe, Colleen, Anna, and Brad for organizing, and it was a pleasure. I learned a lot. One of the themes that really rung true to me, and maybe it's what you meant by iterative, Colleen, is the idea that co-production is one of these essential components of being able to do this well, because no one of us can try to figure this out. And so the other comment about interdisciplinarity resonates with me. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, as we're thinking about co-production in at least the first half of the day, and how that came up numerous times with communities, kind of children defining what it is that's challenging in their neighborhood, and being able to listen to that, in what ways does the financing discussion and that we had in the afternoon. And it's just my lack of awareness, without question. But in what ways does that concept and that theme run through the finance and capital equity discussion that we had before? I heard Ricardo talk a little bit about the communities coming to, or the agencies coming together and identifying a particular kind of investment that might then lean into private capital for funding. And so I'm just trying to think, is that what we mean by co-production in the finance and kind of capital equity discussions, or where does that exactly position?
So I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah,
But
I
I
would say
think
I don't have an answer to it other than I did hear from Ben, there is another feedback loop from research to your evaluation metrics. So that's another, and I did mean that, both iterative of the feedback loop from practitioner to researcher, but also from the financer to researcher.
And Lauren, maybe you could bring the mic up for Ricardo and Ben to weigh in. I think there's a whole bunch of different angles there. In some ways, quantified is the most obvious because they actually link the science and the finance in the bond model. If it doesn't perform, if it performs well, you make more. If it doesn't perform, what's the performance? It's a scientific measure of volume. But I think there's also, we didn't really touch on the scale of governance question and who controls where the money goes question. And what's happening in the private sector now around crowdsourced funding. I don't know if folks know about IOBI in our backyards, but they're doing a remarkable job raising money at the neighborhood level for projects at the neighborhood level. Now, the scale comes in, you know, if we're talking about big water projects, you can't do that by crowdfunding at the moment. Maybe in the future you'll be able to do that, or there'll be blockchain-led intermediaries or something. But, you know, if you're doing the neighborhood one, heavy engagement of the most affected communities, back to that point. If you start moving up to the city level or the state level, you have all sorts of existing agencies that may or may not be culpable in the state, in this, you know, where we are now, and may or may not be engaging with communities in various ways. So certainly in the urban resilience work that I've been involved in looking at cities around the world, there are really interesting questions about what does the city government, formal government decide, and what do community organizations decide? And I think that tension is gonna come more and more to the fore about who represents whom and who gets to decide on where the money goes. You get to the really big projects, then you kind of get into what Anadi was talking about the big financial institutions seeing projects they're willing to invest in that meet their various risk-reward criteria. And if there's too many players or there's too many transaction costs, they're not going to get over the hurdle. So I don't know, Ben or Ricardo, if you want to add to any of that.
Yeah, no, I think you covered it well, Brad. The only one I would add to that is that, yes, our joint benefits authority concept is a co-creation concept. But you look at, you know, district stormwater that I mentioned, that was built together with an NGO, TNC, and there was a co-creation with an NGO. And then there is that concept of different types of money in the capital stack that have different levels of risk tolerance. And helping each other out in a way, or lowering the risk tolerance for somebody who has a higher risk tolerance, which is also another thing that we're going to have to see more of, is public money being used in that way to change the risk profile to allow investors to invest, you know, and I like to say that investors are very simple people. They react to two functions, greed and fear. We just call it risk and reward. And you can turn up the greed dial and get a project done, or turn down the fear dial and get a project done. We just call it turn up the return, turn down the risk, and the two work in tandem. And I think there's lots of ways for different parts of society to play with those dials in such a way to get much more investment going into the sorts of things we want, whether it's communities, whether it's governments, whether it's anybody else, research.
Yeah, I guess I just respond to some of the comments that you made, Brad. The question of who decides what projects these go into, it's been really interesting seeing how some of these different motivations play into the projects themselves and where they're placed. So, comparing DC Water to Atlanta, to like both green infrastructure EIBs, but very different motivations, as I said before. So DC Water, they're like primarily looking for where in the district is the most viable place to capture stormwater. And the two places, one of them was Georgetown, and the other was up in close to Fort Ton, which is a more middle-class neighborhood, not necessarily low-income or economically distressed as other areas of the city. But that if it was just based on where is from a hydrological perspective, where is the best place to put stormwater controls, those were the two neighborhoods that they came up with. With Atlanta, they're taking more of a social impact, community impact first lens, and not necessarily based on how much volume of stormwater can they avoid in the combined sewer system. And therefore, those projects were prioritized in these neighborhoods on the west side of the city, and they're very heavily involved with community-based organizations there as partners throughout the initial conception and design of the projects, as well as they'll probably be involved in some of the ongoing maintenance and employment for those projects.
Which then goes to time.
Right.
Whose time and how much time? Other questions? Maybe we'll go to this side of the room for just a minute and then go over there.
Hi, everybody. I just want to thank Brad, Colleen, Anna, and everyone else who put this on, and all the presenters. It's been a great day, and I can reflect on that in part because I asked a question earlier, and it's not often that you can go to a conference and ask a question earlier in the morning, and then essentially have all the panelists spend the next 5 hours answering it for you. So I'm very
We
thankful.
had a quick confab,
Yeah, it was very well done. And so largely that was about how do you monetize these co-benefits, and then how do you find a payer for them. So I appreciate this conversation. And so one very specific question, I don't know if Michelle is still here or if anybody knows this, so maybe someone else does, but my understanding is that there is kind of a hospital systems equivalent to the Community Reinvestment Act in the banking system. I don't know if there is, I could be a little mistaken, but how do we get to that 8 million that she pointed out in Columbus or wherever that was, or in general, how do we kind of access those, if I'm not mistaken, kind of regulated dollars that need to be spent in hospitals?
Some people call it Obamacare.
Well, okay.
So the Affordable Care Act had a big community health component to it, where particularly nonprofit healthcare organizations had to both do a community health assessment, which goes back to the social determinants of health set of stuff we were talking about, and do a community health improvement plan. And there were a variety of opportunities for money to be spent in a bunch of different ways around those activities. The monies that was pulling from was that a lot of nonprofit hospitals had been spending a lot of money on emergency room care for people who couldn't afford insurance. So there was a lot of money being diverted, and if they, under the Affordable Care Act, got insurance, there should be money available, and that money could be used in communities. We spent a fair amount of time a couple of years ago trying to get more of that money going into community level investments in parks and trails and things like that. And Birmingham, Alabama is actually one of the most successful in that regard, in part working with the hospitals, but mostly with the local county health department, where they have some really remarkable results. Basically, the hospitals had to make that decision sort of hospital by hospital, so it became rapidly decentralized. And Oregon has a state level plan to be the healthiest state in the US, and some of their hospitals used the money that way, but a lot of places did not because they had other sort of things still related to mostly paying for emergency room care that wasn't covered by insurance. I see that whole question, though, of how do you get organizations in the health community contributing some funding to access to natural areas as a huge area of continuing work. We did some initial work in there about 4 years ago, and things have gotten better, so it sort of feels like it's worth ramping up again on that.
I would just add, we one of the Hixon conferences in past was on public health and connections to green. And the case of Birmingham is so successful in part because that public health department receives part of a sales tax. 1 cent of the sales tax goes to that agency. So they're an unusually well-funded municipal public health agency that's directing that money into parkland.
So I'll go over here, and then we'll be done.
Thank you. So my concern is a little bit different in the sense that people that pollute land and go bankrupt have their problem fixed by the public for cleanup and for Superfund sites. So it's taxpayer dollars that are paying to clean up land that's been left like a brownfield. So Connecticut has SEP funds or penalties for businesses that are fined, and that money could go to the community if they could find an entity that would manage the fine money for them. But oftentimes they prefer to just pay the fine and close the book on it because it's easier. And my concern is I would like people that pollute land to be accountable in some way. And for example, English Station took, 30 years to clean up, or it's still not clean, right? And many law cases, maybe we need like a no-fault payment system for polluters. So we do away with all the litigation expense and just get some money from the polluter to clean up. And that could go to a fund for, as an example, stormwater runoff from polluted land could be managed by preventing the runoff to for example, English Station land goes into the harbor directly. And those are just some of the ideas. I appreciate trying to raise public funds through impact investment, but I think that we need to look at the source of the polluter as well to try to get some money from them. Thank you.
So there was a group, I don't know if they still exist, on your supplemental environmental payments SEP thing in New Jersey, that was basically a clearinghouse for environmental organizations and social organizations to learn about what was there. And I'm blanking on the name of it now, but if Connecticut is sitting on a bunch of those funds, then certainly there should be efforts made to get the word out that there are funds available. So I think that's a very good point. I have a question over here, Kath.
Thank you for the event today. It's very informative. I'm Kathleen Shoemaker with the town of Hamden. I'm an appointed official in Hamden, and I'm just kind of reeling with sort of the constituent and neighborhood scale accountability at the grassroots in a town like Hamden, along with the environmental and next level of governance issues and the finance issues. And the municipality is really an interesting actor in the thick of all of that. So I especially appreciate that you're focusing on urban infrastructure and paying attention to the municipal level of governance and environment and accountability. How do we expedite and ramp up these innovations? I know in Hamden we're tackling an issue with our electric utility so that we can both upgrade our streetlight system and maximize the savings that we have on our town budget. It occurs to me after today that we have a conversation we have to have with our regional water authority in tandem with other municipalities about how do we ramp up the green infrastructure in the municipalities. It occurs to me that our health entities have to come to the table for financing much of what we're trying to do in terms of land conservation and open space development. So how do we leverage the kinds of private investment that might be available with the utilities and the municipalities, as well as the public resources that are available, but really ramp this up. And I realize there's a matter of internal municipal organizing across departments. I'm on that. But how do we really ramp up the speed with which we do this? Because it just seems like that's an unmet need at this point. And I'm just laying that on the table.
So it seems to me, well, I don't know, do you want to? Yeah, excellent.
That's why I did have the slide about the small grants program that Circa was running. I mean, that was the point of that small grants program, was to infuse municipalities with a little bit of money to help them get through that first step of planning, because often what we see is that when the federal grants come in, municipalities are struggling with the capacity to respond to those RFPs, and they need to have done some smaller scale planning effort first. They really do need to have something on the shelf, and particularly when it came to disaster recovery funds. I read through many of the applications that came from municipalities after Sandy, and it was very clear that they hadn't thought about what they might do with millions of dollars if this had happened in their community. And so it was kind of like a grab for whatever was on the shelf, and the things that were on the shelf at that time were not all that great, and there were some huge missed opportunities. Great opportunities taken, like in New Haven is a great example of a municipality that had done some initial groundwork and then said, oh, we can take that disaster recovery money and now build 200 bioswales instead of 20. But yeah, that's what I would say, is that I think support for small accelerator grants, and Rhode Island's doing that too, can really help get municipalities lined up. And then it's really on the municipalities to be as opportunistic as you possibly can. I know that municipalities struggle with capacity, and that you have officials who are wearing 5 different hats. So try to work together, try to use your COG too. It's another resource that you might be able to use a lot more.
And I don't mean to be flip, but one of the things that excites me about the progress that's been made in this area, and the reason why New Haven did what it did, is because green infrastructure, access to natural areas, helps them solve a problem they're trying to solve more cheaply with lots of co-benefits. And that's what this is about, is, okay, what's your problem? And how can green infrastructure help you solve it with co-benefits? And I think that's a wonderful segue to thanking the speakers who are remaining in the room. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your expertise, what you've learned, and thanks to all of you for sticking it out till the end and all your great questions and comments. So I think that's a wrap.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
I was like ready to be like, oh, this is going to be so interesting. I was so, yeah.
Hey.